Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, welcome. My name is Steve Coll, and I'm the president of the New America Foundation, and I'd like to welcome you to our conference. We've got a full house today, obviously. Some of you are standing in the back. Please be courteous to everybody. If there's empty chairs, put your hand up and guide people to them. And if you are sitting on furniture in the back and stuff, just be aware of your neighbors and don't stampede. This is an event as part of a partnership called the Future Tense Partnership, which brings together the New America Foundation, where you are today, Slate magazine, our partners in this and other endeavors, and Arizona State University. It was born last year for the purpose of trying to bring to Washington policy discussions about how technology was changing the world that Washington routinely makes assumptions about, and to try to look a little bit further over the horizon than discourse in this town sometimes allows, with particular reference to upheavals and disruptions and changes created by technological innovation. I suppose if we had been brilliant at this endeavor a year ago, we would have talked about how social media and digital technology were going to upend authoritarian governments in the Middle East, but here we are catching up with that subject and trying to look ahead around the corner. We're very pleased as well today to welcome Michael Posner, the Assistant Secretary of State, who's going to make keynote remarks and catch us up on the Obama administration's internet freedom agenda after this initial conversation that I'll hold with Sami in Tunis. I just wanted to acknowledge him and thank him for being with us today. And you can, we are streaming live. There are a couple of cameras here. We're also broadcasting this live. So just be aware when questions from the audience come up as part of the program over the afternoon. You're on the record. Please wait for a microphone. Please ask questions that are succinct and relevant to the folks who are talking up on the stage, and try to avoid long speeches and comments. And you can also follow along whether you're here or watching online. There's a Twitter conversation that's at the hashtag 140REV, 140REV. So with that, I'm going to rely upon the magic of Skype. Sami, can you hear me? Audio. It sounds like you can hear me, but we can see you, but we're having trouble hearing you so far. So why don't you just say another hello, and we'll see if we've fixed it.
Yes. Hello, everybody.
Great.
I can hear you.
Great.
Well.
Hello, Sami. Well, thank you for being with us. Good to see you again. And I wanted we only have 20 minutes to sketch a conversation about obviously a very complicated subject that you've been centrally involved in. But I wanted actually to ask you to tell the audience here a little bit about Nawat and the origins of online activism, blogging, and social media in Tunisia during the authoritarian period in the years before the revolution gathered momentum. Tell us how this began and what did the activity consist of, and how did it lead to the position that these activists were in December?
Okay, thank you, Steve, for the invitation. Thank you all for being there. Well, the blog Nawat is a collective blog dedicated to provide a platform for anyone, mainly bloggers and digital activists, to publish their writing about issues that concern them and concern political life and social and economic situation in 2004. And Nawat means in Arabic the core. The online media scene in Tunisia, we can bring it back to the late 90s, the beginning of 2000s, when we've seen a few initiatives first coming from the civil society, some political party like the Congress for the Republic, which actually started building forum board and websites dedicated to publish his political views and discuss and debate the situation in Tunisia. And then we've seen Takriz.com, which is a website mainly run by teenagers at that time. And they were using very social and popular language outside of the box. Then we've seen a popular forum which was called Tunisian, run by Zuhair Yahyawi, the first cyber dissident who was jailed in Tunisia in 2001, for publishing a poll asking the visitor of the forum to vote whether Tunisia was a zoo or a prison or a republic. And then we've seen, since the beginning of that arrest of Zuhair Yahyawi, we've seen a lot of activists and human rights advocates gathering around that website, defending and mobilizing the international public opinion and Tunisians themselves to support the case of Zuhair Yahyawi, who passed away 18 months after his release from prison in 2003. And then we've seen the arrest of the youth of Zarzis in 2003. There were around 7 young people who were arrested for accessing opposition websites. They were accused for downloading materials and documents about how to manufacture a bomb, etc., which were accusations like manufactured by the justice system under Ben Ali's regime. At that time, the censorship of online platforms were only targeting clearly websites that are dedicated to criticize the government in Tunisia. And with the emergence of the phenomenon of blogs starting from 2003, 4, and 5, we've witnessed a wave of censorship targeting those blogs. And we've witnessed also a self-censorship coming from the Tunisian bloggers as well, who were avoiding discussing any political issues. We've seen only few hardcore bloggers who are dedicated to talk and debate the political situation under the dictatorship, and mainly dedicating their time and energy and creativity and platform to fight against the online censorship. And that fight, breaking the wall of the fear that was, as we can remember, handicapping the Tunisian activists from talking about sensitive issues, were the main fight that gathered online activists around the battle to gain free access to information and free dissemination of information online. And then we've seen a massive blocking of social media platform. In the beginning of 2007, Tunisia blocked access to the popular video sharing website Dailymotion, then YouTube. In 2008, they tried to block Facebook during 10 days, but the protest was so high that Ben Ali unblocked the websites after that protest. In 2010, we've seen the blocking of all video sharing websites in Tunisia, Blip TV, Fimayo, Mita Cafe, Vat TV, Flickr.com, etc. And this can explain why the Tunisian internet activists gathered around Facebook, simply because Facebook was the only remaining platform, social media platform in Tunisia that was unblocked. And we can ask ourselves why during the revolution the President Ben Ali didn't block Facebook. He was aware that Facebook represents a very dangerous platform where Tunisians were organizing and mobilizing the public opinion during the protest. But he was afraid that blocking the social media platform Facebook will fuel the protests, and that's how we can understand the theory why Ben Ali didn't block Facebook during the revolution. But the online activism actually bridged the gap in a way between the civil society, NGOs, traditional human rights advocates, and the cyber dissidents movement, who were mainly very independent and very critical towards the government of Ben Ali and towards the action of the opposition that were at that time very unpopular, very ideological in their discourse, etc. So in a way, the censorship really killed the online content in Tunisia. We've witnessed a massive migration from blogs to Facebook. We've witnessed migration from YouTube, LibTV, Vimeo, Dailymotion to Facebook, from Flickr to Facebook. And in that regard, Facebook became the hub in which normal internet users, political activists, human rights advocates, political party, opposition figures gathered together and managed to mobilize the entire population, starting from the second week of the revolution. And on the meantime, the online censorship in Tunisia created a generation that knows how to circumvent censorship, that knows how to use proxy, that knows how to secure their communication channels, despite the fact that Tunisia during those years were using Gmail phishing, Facebook phishing. They were cracking and hacking many accounts on Facebook and on Gmail and spying and monitoring the activity of online activists. And we've witnessed the arrest of many activists before and during the revolution, thanks to those techniques of Gmail and Facebook phishing. But in general, that censorship created a generation that was tech-savvy, very consciousness about the context in which they can use the tools and implement them in their own context.
So, Sami, thank you very much for that. And I should have introduced you properly. I think many people here know about you, but for those among us who don't, Sami is the Advocacy Director of Global Voices, which is an international community of bloggers and citizen journalists and writers around the world. And that he is, as he described here, the co-founder of Nawat. And Sami is a Tunisian. He's from a town called Begat, about 100 clicks from Tunis. And he was forced into exile himself, what, around 2000?
98.
98. And from Europe and other places, he organized much of the activity that he just described. And I think one of the themes in that very cogent narrative that he just provided is that the internet activism and the Facebook activity that burst into the West's view last winter had very, very deep roots, involved diverse organizations, those online and off. And then the second fascinating theme that he just described about how the strategy of censorship of the Tunisian government by knocking out YouTube and Flickr essentially forced everyone onto the Facebook space and connected apolitical and political communities, and that Ben Ali could not shut that space down because he was frightened of the consequences in the apolitical audience that was there. Sami, we just have a couple of minutes left, regrettably, but I want you to take those minutes and talk to us about where we are now. One observation that's made about the Facebook revolutions in the West is that the nature of the organizing, the communities, the decentralized community and the ethic of those communities hasn't yielded leadership of a traditional political type, that there's a great powerful sense of possession and engagement with the achievements of the revolution by those who brought it into being, as we see today, even now in Tahrir Square. But the question is, where does the next phase come from? What is the situation in Tunisia today among the communities that brought the revolution into being? Yeah. And what are your thoughts about how this will translate into sustained political change or fail to do so?
Well, briefly, I tend to disagree with that remark that the revolution in Tunisia and even in Egypt was leaderless. I mean, on the macro revolutionary movement in Tunisia, there was no central leadership like leading and organizing and mobilizing the masses. But on the regional and the city level, in every city, in every neighborhood, there were leaders who were mobilizing and organizing and scanding those slogans that were highly politicized. So I tend to disagree that the revolution has no leadership. I mean, the challenges now that we are facing, mainly in Tunisia, is regarding the defense of the online freedom of expression and the repuzzling and rebuilding the media scene in Tunisia. I mean, we've seen a free internet in Tunisia weeks after the fall of Ben Ali, and then we've witnessed the return of the online censorship. First, they blocked for Facebook pages under libel and call to violence. And the block was ordered by a military court, and then we've seen a court ordering overblocking of all pornographic websites in Tunisia, which I think is very worrying development. And we have a lot of activists and advocates in Tunisia who are dedicating their time and energy to try to convince the lawyer and the court about the uses of the online censorship as implemented within the hands of a central body, which is the Tunisian Internet Agency. Regarding the media scene, I think the centralized media ecosystem in Tunisia is based in Tunis, the capital, and those regions, those marginalized regions that triggered the revolution are still voiceless. And we've witnessed many citizen media platforms popping up from the ground, trying to give voices to the voiceless, and through online TV, through online radio, through online platform. And I think this is a very huge challenge that we need to understand and to deal with. The other thing is this conflict between the old generation who lived under Ben Ali and many who are part of the former ruling party who are reconverting themselves into new political parties in order to not to lose the spaces that they were monopolizing, and the dynamic of the revolution, which is sometimes very radical and not pragmatic in their demand and in their approach on how to reach those demands. So it is a very healthy situation in which we are witnessing a very healthy debates and reshaping of the Tunisian identity. The Islamists and the laicist school in Tunisia are really fighting openly against each other. But I think this is a very healthy situation. It is the first time that Tunisia lives under a sphere of freedom, and I think this kind of debate is welcome. But the challenges is how to reshape the media ecosystem in Tunisia through the use of online platform.
Great. Well, we'll have to leave it there, Sami, and I know you'll be important in that effort to reshape that ecosystem, and I'm really very grateful to you for taking the time to be with us. And it's a very rare opportunity for us in Washington to hear directly. I hope we can make a habit out of that while you're in Tunis and carrying this work forward. So thank you again for being with us.
Thank you, Steve, for inviting me. Thank you.
I don't think he can hear your applause, but I'm sure he'd appreciate knowing that you offered it. Oh, he can. Excellent. So it's only left for me to introduce Jake Weisberg to move to the next session. Jake is our partner. He's the chairman and editor-in-chief of the Slate Group. He was the editor of Slate itself from 2002 to 2008. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Bush Tragedy, and the co-author of a book called In an Uncertain World, which is also an appropriate basis for this transition at the podium. Jake Weisberg.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. I just want to say that Slate is extremely proud of this partnership with the New America Foundation around the Future 10 series, and this event is absolutely what we were going for, the kind of thing we were trying to accomplish when we came up with this idea. I want to introduce Michael Posner. Michael is Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, where he's been since 2009 at the State Department. Before that, he was the Executive Director, then the President of Human Rights First. Some people may remember that was the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, I believe, before it was Human Rights First. And he's had a long and distinguished career in this field. He played a key role in the campaign for the American Law for Political Asylum, which happened in 1980, and also in the creation of the International Criminal Court. One of his less frequently cited distinctions is that he's a graduate of Francis Parker School in Chicago, where, as it happens, I also went. Michael is going to make some remarks, and then I'm going to follow up with some questions.
Thanks, Jay. Great. Well, thanks, Jake. It's really great to be here. I want to thank Slate, the New America Foundation, and Arizona State University for sponsoring today's conversation on internet freedom, which I believe is one of the game-changing human rights issues of our time. I also want to thank Andres Martinez for inviting me here. We've known each other a long time in lots of different capacities, and it's great to be reconnected. I get a lot of invitations to speak these days, but most of them are a lot less cool than this one. Usually the cool invitations go to my colleague Ian Schuler, who's our resident techie in the Bureau of Human Rights, Democracy, and Labor. Ian's going to be speaking later this afternoon on a panel with Sasha Minrath about the Internet in a Suitcase program that we're doing funding, and it's being done here at New America. I want to thank also Steve Coll for his leadership in that effort. I'm particularly pleased to be here today because as I look around this room, there are so many leaders, policymakers, journalists, techies, activists. I see Rebecca McKinnon in the second row, who's been such a leading voice on these issues for so many years and a great colleague. All of you have helped shape this conversation, and many have helped governments, including our own, come to grips with the challenges and the opportunities that are posed by this transformational set of new technologies. We're excited about the Internet in a Suitcase project, one of a number of cutting-edge technologies and projects we're investing in. It's part of what Secretary Clinton calls a venture capitalist approach to addressing the wide range of challenges that democracy and human rights activists face in internet repressive environments around the world. By the end of this year, my Bureau will have led the efforts within the U.S. government to award $70 million in grants. We're supporting a dozen different circumvention technologies. We're supporting a panic button app for mobile phones, a slingshot program to identify censored content that users searching for in a particular country and then flinging it back over the firewalls where ordinary citizens can get access to it. Training programs to help activists operating in repressive areas to keep operating, thwart surveillance, and protect their privacy. To date, we've trained 5,000 activists in all regions of the world. In short, we're finding a whole slew of new tools and techniques that empower users to gain access to information, organize them, tell their own stories, and to stay safe online. But this is not just about technology. Secretary Clinton has put internet freedom on the map as a diplomatic priority. In our bilateral relationships and in our multilateral relationships, including at the UN Human Rights Council, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which just had a ministerial meeting, and in a range of other places. Many of you here today have urged us not to view internet freedom in isolation, but to wrestle with it with the challenge of integrating internet freedom with national security, combating cyber crime, protecting intellectual property, and other vital interests. And this is what we've done in President Obama's international strategy on cyberspace, which incorporates all of these interests. This is the hard part. It's where Americans disagree not only with repressive governments, but among ourselves. But we agree on the importance of getting it right. By now, every government understands the power of ordinary citizens to harness the internet and social media to organize and express their views. Some have embraced these new technologies as a way to connect and to serve their citizens. Others are redoubling their efforts to control them. We are seeing the development of a more sophisticated set of tools for cyber repression, including filtering, surveillance, anti-circumvention, and network disabling technologies by government security forces in closed societies. We're also witnessing the rise of cyber attacks, of computers, of independent media, distributed denial of service attacks on sites of watchdog groups, and other attempts to thwart the work of civil society. Before I joined this administration, as Jake said, I spent 30 years working on human rights issues from the low-tech NGO side. So now I want to refocus attention not on technologies to fight internet repression, but on the psychology of the repressors. What causes a regime to perceive the internet as such a profound threat that it is willing to damage its country's economy by choking bandwidth, blocking content, or even shutting down the network entirely. These are the acts of governments that fear their own people. In cracking down on the internet, they expose their own lack of legitimacy. But these crackdowns also indicate a basic lack of understanding that free speech, whether it's supportive speech or subversive speech, is harder than ever to suppress in the digital age. And the young people who have taken to the streets across the Arab world this year understand it isn't pornography or pirating that is being suppressed. It's people. It's their demands for dignity, and its say in the political and economic future of their countries. After all, Facebook does not foment dissent. People do. Twitter only amplifies those voices that have the most resonance, those ideas that people find most powerful. As President Obama said in his speech in Cairo in June of 2009, 19 months before the protests in Tahrir Square, suppressing ideas never succeeds in making them go away. 2 billion people today have access to the internet. That's a lot of speech to try to suppress. But in the next 20 years, nearly 5 billion more people will come online. 5 billion. Will they be joining a true global conversation over a single unified global network? Or will they be entering a stilted alternative reality of government-approved content on controlled national intranets? This is the vision of the halal internet being advocated by some in Iran, a course that would only deepen that country's isolation and the Iranian government's estrangement from their own citizens. So let's be honest. Governments that respect the rights of their citizens have no reason to fear a free internet. The internet didn't topple the governments of Tunisia or Egypt. The people did. By smart governments are using social media tools to better communicate with and understand their own people and to deliver services in a more open and accountable fashion. And they are recognizing that free access to tech tools spurs both economic and social progress. If you really want to address popular discontent, you don't need an army of censors deleting posts on social media sites. You need a cadre of government officials reading those posts and figuring out how to identify and address the legitimate grievances that are being expressed there. So don't shoot the instant messenger. Instead, address the underlying grievances. The corruption, the abuse of power, the environmental degradation, the lack of political and economic opportunity, the daily affronts to dignity by indifferent authorities. More than anything else, it is this quest for dignity that has prompted so many young people to walk away from their keyboards and into the streets to demand a chance to build a better future. And it's their vision of the future that really matters. This administration is working to support them. Our work on internet freedom is not about messaging, it's about empowerment. It's up to the people of each country to build societies in which government respect not some rights part of the time, but all rights of the governed every day. The role of the international community is to offer support, technological and institutional. Your generation, the digital natives, has developed new tools with unprecedented potential to empower people around the world to participate in a truly democratic process. The world is eager to see what you will invent next. But we're equally eager for your help in forging international consensus and setting the expectations needed to support internet freedom. It will be up to your generation to make this vision a reality for the 5 billion users by setting the rules of the road for the internet for the 21st century. The human challenge of the internet and internet freedom is to use technological tools to build a different kind of relationship between citizens, civil society, and their governments. A relationship based not merely upon the content of the governed, the consent of the governed, but also broad participation in governance by all citizens. With your help, we'll continue to put U.S. diplomatic power behind this vision and a more inclusive, peaceful, and democratic world. Thank you.
Michael, thank you for those remarks. And just to pick up first on what might be the newsiest part of what you said, we've seen in recent weeks a kind of ratcheting up of the rhetoric from the Obama administration about the crackdown in Syria in particular, and about the legitimacy of that regime. Are you going a little farther than we've heard previously in criticism of the Syrian regime's crackdown?
Well, yesterday I testified in Congress to the Lantos Commission on Syria. My comments very much today reflect what the President said yesterday, what the Secretary of State said the day before. We are increasingly aware that the people of Syria are under the gun, are being attacked for peacefully demonstrating, for organizing, for speaking out about things that have long been human rights violations in that country. And we are committed to reinforcing their voices. This is not about us, it's about the Syrian people. But as we've seen, particularly in the last 6 or 8 weeks, the Syrian people have lost their fear, and they are demanding accountability and openness and a free democratic space which hasn't existed. And we want to be standing behind them.
So maybe talk about Syria a little bit in relation to what happened to Egypt. If you watch this closely and you watch it from the perspective of rooting for the opposition, as I will certainly acknowledge that I have been, you have to ask yourself the question, why did this work in such a dramatic way in Egypt and bring down the government? And why has it so far not worked in Syria, despite, as you say, the courage of these Syrian opposition leaders who are obviously, in some sense, playing for their lives?
You know, as we look around the Middle East region, North African region, the one thing that's more and more obvious is that you have to take each of these countries on their own terms, given their own history and given where they are. There was simply much greater space in Egypt. Many more civil society activists, and a greater opportunity for them to come together, and a government that frankly allowed them to demonstrate peacefully. All of those things contributed, but there was a much greater, I would say, opportunity, both in Tunisia but especially in Egypt, for the kinds of protests to succeed. Syria has been a harshly ruled country for many, many years, with a government that doesn't really know boundaries and has used violence in dramatic ways. People were demonstrating in Hama the last 6 weeks. President Assad's father killed at least 10,000 people there in 1982. So the fear factor was greater, and the fact that people have lost their fear and said, whatever happens, we're going to stand in the street, we're not going to be violent, we're going to demonstrate, and if they're going to shoot, they're going to shoot. That's where we are today.
So 3 big factors, and maybe give me a little bit of a sense of how you rate their importance. One is the simple connectedness of a society. In Libya, it's not that connected, which makes things very difficult. Another, arguably the most important, is the underlying strength of civil society that existed before the internet and beyond the internet. And a third, as you were referring to, is how repressive or aggressive or authoritarian the regime has been or is willing to be. Clearly a big factor in Iran. Are those the most decisive factors in the sort of the question of whether this sort of technology-aided opposition can succeed?
Yeah, I think those are the biggest factors. And what's interesting is that even in some of the more closed societies, the Syrians have tried in all sorts of ways to limit connectivity and people being able to communicate. They are communicating, and they're communicating across the country, so you don't just have demonstrations in one town or one region. It's the combination, I would say, of the internet, new technologies, and television. People are seeing images, and they're seeing images of what's happening in the region, and they're also seeing images of what's happening at home. I think those things are driving the discussion, but again, the technology alone isn't enough. People have to be themselves ready to take to the streets or to organize, and civil society organizations in Syria are evolving, but they're coming out of a very tough environment.
How does the Obama administration and how does Secretary Clinton and how do you see the proper role of the United States government in aiding these movements or not? You know, there's been money appropriated to help opposition leaders, opposition figures get around restrictions, firewalls, and so on. But you know, any help we give always comes with the potential stigma that the United States is involved in what would otherwise be an indigenous and local movement. How do you balance those things?
You know, we start from the premise that change occurs most effectively within a society. We can't force it from outside, but we can be helpful in both amplifying the voices of domestic activists who are trying to raise these issues. We can provide some measure of protection to them, and we can help create an international environment where these issues are discussed in a more intelligent way. We try to do all of those things, but we are very mindful of the importance of reinforcing the domestic voices. This is not about us, it's about them. And it's about governments that are refusing to allow their own people to stand up and speak for what they want. They want economic opportunity, they want a job, they want a say in their political future, and they want to be treated with dignity. Those are the basic components, whether you're in Syria or in Egypt or in Libya. And so what our job is, as we see it, is to make sure we stand for international standards of human rights, and we start with the premise that people need to be able to speak their mind and participate in the process.
Yeah. Michael, you know, I think I remember when I was in high school, you coming back to speak, as I said, as a distinguished alumnus and talking about human rights, and I remember it being one of the things that got me excited, really, as a kid about the issue. But as someone who's spent your whole career working on these issues, does the internet really change anything? I mean, are these simply the same liberal principles applied around some new technology and some new techniques, or are things really different in some fundamental way?
You know, I think the answer is it changes a lot. I said in the remarks it's a game changer, but it's essentially taking old values, old human rights principles, free speech, free assembly, free association, and giving them and amplifying them. So now it's not a matter of, you know, doing samizdat, doing, you know, pieces of paper that you hand out in a square. It's opening up to everybody in your society, in fact, everybody in the world. It empowers people. It allows them to do what they've always wanted to do with governments less able to control it. The flip side is that governments are so nervous about this that they've begun to crack down. And so there's sort of a cat and mouse game going on, and we're trying to stay one step ahead of the cat.
Yeah. You know, there's this sort of debate that goes on, which is a little bit frustrating and a little bit simplified, but between the sort of cyber utopians on the one hand who think everything has changed and, you know, the power of this technology is such that repressive regimes over some medium term don't stand a chance. And on the other hand, cyber skeptics who think, wait a minute, a lot of these tools are proving much more effective in the hands of authoritarian regimes than they are in the hands of opposition leaders. And then there are some people in the middle. Where are you in that spectrum?
I'd call myself a cyber optimist. I don't think it's the answer to everything, but I think it's so much part of the solution. And what the challenges we faced with governments, you know, misusing the technology and you know, imposing censorship and breaking people's right to privacy, I think we just have to figure out how to overcome those things. The reality is the world is very different today because of this ability to communicate, and we need to take advantage of it. It will be to our interest in the long run.
Yeah. How in particular do you think we can help opposition figures, and not just opposition figures, people who want honest information, get around firewalls, and particularly in China? I mean, in China, my sense is that it's not that hard for people who have some technological sophistication to use a proxy server and get around a firewall. But most people don't, either because they're afraid or because it's a hassle or because their opinions actually conform more or less to what they've been given through official sources.
Yeah, you know, I was in China in April. I've been there 3 or 4 times since I'm in this job. And one of the things that's very striking to me is there are a number of Chinese citizens, I wouldn't even call them all activists, but people who have concerns about labor issues, about tainted milk, about the environment, And what they want increasingly is the ability to speak to one another and to get information that exists within that society. We've spent a lot of time trying to think about how to break through a firewall to present our information to them. In fact, they're Chinese that want to know what's happening in the neighboring city, the neighboring village, and they are very resourceful in trying to figure out how to overcome the technical obstacles. I think increasingly the Chinese government and others that put resources to try to stop that are fighting a losing battle. People are demanding information, and they're creative in going and getting it.
Do you think a big shift is going to require some technological breakthrough, like a freedom box that people in this country will have to help Chinese opposition figures, or do you think it's sort of all in place already?
No, I think our role is to keep pushing for an open internet that crosses borders, that's a neutral platform that allows people to use these technologies for whatever purpose, if it's commercial, if it's for educators, for innovators, or it's for activists. I think our job is to protect the space that's been created so wonderfully and prevent governments from trying and others from trying to restrict it in ways that will make that less effective.
Now, when you talk about restriction and censorship on the internet, someone does have to censor the internet. I mean, when you think about it, you and I would agree that there's certain things that should not be allowed, whether it's child pornography or information about manufacture of nuclear weapons. There's some minimum number of things, and we would try to keep them small, that we would agree should be censored. But who should censor them? Right now we have a kind of patchwork of technology companies, ISPs, governments. You know, how do you distinguish the kinds of censorship that's legitimate from the kind that's not, and who should be in charge of it?
You know, we have, before the internet was invented, we've had discussions for years in this country and every country about what are the legitimate controls on speech. And so this is really just the next generation of that. I think we need to find rules of the road, again, that are rooted in what you described. There are clear categories of things like pornography for children, or like, you know, implements of terrorism and violence that we want to control. Every government tries to do that. But here it's interesting, you have to deal with the range of governments, but also the private sector and the activists and the world of consumers. So finding the way to incorporate all of their interests and at the same time come up with these rules of the road is one of the challenges we face going forward. It won't be easy, but we're going to figure out how to do it.
Is it a national issue? Is it a supranational issue? I mean, who, you know, what's the body that's going to do that?
I think it's going to be certainly it's a national issue for us in every country, but there has to be some international discussion of that. I can't tell you right now that there's an obvious body to do that, and I think we need to be mindful of the multi-stakeholder, the multiple interests here. It's not just a matter of a dozen governments sitting in a room in Geneva and figuring it out. It's a much more lively discussion, and it should be.
Lastly, I wanted to ask you, Michael, about the big technology companies themselves and their role. Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Yahoo are frequently drawn into these issues around China, around Russia, around their cooperation with regimes or not, about whether they cooperate in censorship. What sort of attitude do you expect or would you like to see from these companies? Should they simply be, as Facebook has portrayed itself, kind of a neutral provider of a service that anybody can use? Or, you know, do you see them having a kind of social and human rights responsibility in terms of trying to be helpful to people who are on the right side of these issues?
Well, one of the things that Rebecca and I and others in this room, I'm sure, have worked on is trying to, and this is before I got into government, trying to create some standards or some principles on both internet freedom and privacy for the private sector. There's an organization, a private organization called the Global Network Initiative. And much to their credit, Google, Yahoo, and Microsoft have all participated in that. And I think one of the things that now coming into government I'm very aware of is that we need the private sector to step up. We need them to work with one another to try to find some common guidelines and to really be a partner with governments like ours to try to figure out strategies for challenging both restrictions on free expression and also on privacy.
But you see them having an active role in challenging restrictions.
Yeah, there's a limit to what they can do in a given circumstance, but we need to figure out what are the best practices, what can companies do individually and collectively to push back against governments that are up to no good.
So Facebook approved in China will not be a happy headline from your perspective?
Well, you know, we're not telling any company what to do in a particular country. What we are encouraging is that the companies come together, establish guidelines, live by those guidelines, and then work with us.
Mike, I want to thank you for those comments, and we keep the trains running on time here at Future Tense, and I want to now hand things over to Andreas Martinez. Thank you. I'm sorry. Andreas is the head of the Fellows Program here, and he co-runs the Future Tense program. So, thank you.
Hello. Before we go on to the next segment, just a very quick programming note, which is that as you can see, we're trying to cram a lot into an afternoon, so apologies that we're not getting to question and answers for some of these sessions, but I just want to remind everybody that there will be refreshments at the end of the entire session, and most of the participants will be around and eager for conversation then. So apologies that some of these sessions we're not able to get to Q&As. I also just I wanted to quickly introduce, if you could just sort of wave, Tori Bosch, who is the editor of our Future Tense content on Slate magazine, and there's going to be a lot more of that in coming months. And Joel Garreau, you could take a bow. Joel is a former New America Schwartz Fellow who is now on the faculty of Arizona State University and is my partner in crime in putting together these Future Tense events. Now I'd like to introduce our next segment, which is a presentation by Professor Marlena Lim entitled Friending Revolution, Social Media and Political Change in Egypt and Beyond. And speaking of our content on Slate and our partnership with Slate Magazine, you can see a version of this that's been published on the Slate website. Marlena is a professor at the Consortium of Science, Policy, and Outcomes in the Social Inquiry Program at Arizona State University. She researches the mutual shaping of technology and society, and she's an active blogger who blogs in English, Indonesian, and Sudanese. And we're lucky to have her. Marlena?
Thank you, Andres. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm excited to be here because I've been reading these people's blogs for years, and thank you. So there is a joke that I want to tell. I believe, I think most of you have heard of, but I will tell you anyway. So since afterlife, in the afterlife, there is a so-called presidential lounge where all presidents who die, right, before they have this judgment going to heaven and hell, they have to enter this one. So, and there are two groups of presidents, poison or parade, because most presidents, they die when they're poisoned or being shot at the parades, right? Okay. Kennedy, parade, right? And then Nasser come in and then poison. And then Anwar Sadat, parade, right? And then here is Ben Ali and Mubarak holding hands. They're entering this and then poison or parade? There's a poke, Facebook. Poison or parade? Poke, Facebook. Poison or parade? Choose, sir. We were poked on Facebook, okay? So the whole Facebook thing is like so big, and then people call it Facebook revolution, sometimes Twitter revolution. But it's sort of like people, even those people who were on the street there almost believe that it was Facebook, right? But we are here and we agree that it was not Facebook revolution, it was people revolution, right? I think I agree with Mr. Posner, is people did it, right? The question here is not so much about whether it's Facebook or people, because it's certainly people. But the question, what is the actual roles of the social medias? How people use it? How, why, for what? What they were capable to be used for? And what people have to do if we wanted to do that? And I think to be able to understand this, we need to look beyond Facebook. We need to look beyond social media. And if, in fact, we need to look beyond Tahrir Square moment. I hope so. So we agree there's the cause, right? The whole repression, oppression, corruption, poverty, unemployment, they are collective grievance. So they are there, right? Without this, people wouldn't want to join any popular movement. And certainly, I'm talking about Egypt and Middle East. Their corruption perception index is high. Just quickly glance. Youth employment is high. But also, there's other thing. This is that there is a structural dynamic that creates opportunities, right? Without something that creates opportunities, because there are so many people in the world who got this collective grievance, but they couldn't do anything about that. Lucky, like in the Middle East, actually literacy rate is really high. And also, media in general is quite active. You got Al Jazeera, for example, Pan-Arab satellite is there. Internet growth in MENA region is actually 1,900% per year, which is, while the words in general is not per year in the last 10 years, while the words in general is only 426%, right? But we also got something unique, which is the affordance, the combination of youth and social media. The fact that this region, that's China, right? This whole pyramids, the population, that's United States. But this region have this kind of pyramids where young population is high and social media by the youths is really high. Like, really, these people, this is all about these people who are on that range of age, like 15 to 25 or 35, right? And I'm not talking about the roles of social media for democracy at all. I'm specifically talking about mobilization here. How these people mobilize using social media. What is the role of social media? And in fact, this is not about democracy because even if, right, you got to mobilize, it doesn't mean you're gonna have, you would be able to topple the dictator. If you have the regime change, it doesn't mean you're gonna have reform. And it doesn't really transform into democracy altogether. There are a lot of work to be done here. So I just focus on that thing. So here's the thing. Most people like looking at whoa, how did that happen? It's surprising, right? These people like finally we didn't even know they got Facebook. We didn't even know they got young people who are techie, right? That's because we made them invisible. Because how could you understand something when you made them invisible in the first place? Didn't pay attention, right? Very little coverage on Egypt in general on our TV, our newspapers, right? Al Jazeera, perhaps the only one that really have been covering. To understand, every moment actually has a history. It doesn't come from nowhere. Where these people come from? It's not, these people didn't only work for a week or 2 weeks or 2 months, right? If you look at the whole history, whole activism, social society movement, oppositional networks there are a lot of things going on before Tahrir moment. I just point you out, some people pulling out until November, but actually further than that. Some people think, oh, okay, since June, but actually further than that, right? There are more before. This is all recorded, and I might miss some recorded popular movements in Cairo, Alexandria, mostly. And here was the first anti-Mubarak movement, which is December 2004, Kafaya. And if you want to pull further, Kafaya was actually here. The first one actually was able to transform Intifada sentiment into something more internal, into anti-government movement. And it marked the beginning of oppositional Egyptian street politics since then. Like hundreds, literally hundreds of street protests. And what is interesting about Kafaya, okay, I'll just skip that one. So traditional cluster of oppositional networks in Egypt was usually formal, based on parties, Islamists, right, like Muslim Brotherhood, or reformists, or leftists, that Communist Party there. But Kafaya is the first one that is really movement, not really a formal organization. This is a movement, fluid, loose affiliation. It's more like this. The network is more like that. You got Islamists and leftists, actually, and secularists joining the movement, which didn't happen before. And this is also, what is interesting is also, the Kafaya movement was the first that had no permanent meeting place nor headquarters. They use website. One of their meeting place is actually Mr. Digital, which was formed in 2004, while Abbas is the administrator. He is one of the key leaders in Tahrir revolt. And also, these people were blogging. So among the very first generation of bloggers in Egypt, actually mostly are activists. And blogging was very important here because blogging enabled these activists to avoid the crackdown of the government. We are imagining 2004, 2005. The government was behind and not yet there in tracking down. They deliberate over issue and was able to take on, actually, got quite a successful initial success. They were different because the name is simple, Kafaya, enough, right? We got enough with Mubarak. But they're also using ICT, using emails, using mobile phone texting, put line on online banner, and got the some printing version as well. Going to the street, keep going to the street, even when sometime they got, at one time they had, they held the protest, 300 people in Tahrir Square. This is back in May 2005, and the 300 of them walking toward Tahrir Square got stopped by 600 police. Like sometimes there are more police, right? But they keep doing it. Sometimes they got success. Actually, occasionally they get thousands. So this kind of thing going on until the government suddenly increased the whole policing the street, I mean, really tightly, arrested people, and eventually arrest some bloggers. In 2006, 2007, a lot of arrests on bloggers and the street. And even then, the blogosphere of post-election, especially, the blogosphere of Egypt is thriving. People blog, and even Muslim Brotherhood kind of join. You identify that some youth wing of Muslim Brotherhood are less Islamist. They are kind of light green, not so deep green. And they are connected with the whole Kafaya. And this is just by 2009, Egyptian blogosphere is the largest one. Actually, like a third of Arabic blogosphere, or even more, almost like half of this. But what is interesting is that the Kafaya Youth for Change, right? It's this youth version. They want to be more popular. They took on Facebook in 2008 and starting to take all strategies of Kafaya, introduce new thing. They understand the weakness of Kafaya was they was limited to inner circle, right? How to embrace larger group, how to embrace weak ties, people with weak tie association in sociology, from strong tie and connect to weak ties. And Facebook is a good way to do it because you get just these young people, and you know, when everybody click like the group, and then 10 of your friends like this certain group, you feel that you have to like too. You have to get to be cool, right? this is actually happening. Some people, I do research in Indonesia, and then some teenagers join certain social movement, and they said, well, you know, it's not cool not joining. All of my friends are there, and then I got this. Everybody keep like, oh, A and B are joining. Another friend are joining. You got to keep up, you know, right? So that's and especially true in communal society. So the whole culture, participatory culture, enter politics, where politics merging with the culture, the teenager youth culture, and that's a perfect combination to get the youth, which is big population, right, to engage. But especially becoming very popular after Arabic Facebook, which is in 2009 being launched. And so the strong tie and weak ties. And then, of course, there's some other things that are being introduced later on by we are all Khalid Syed, which is emotion, that breaking the fear. The thing is, people agree that we have to get rid of this regime, but we are afraid. As so many people got arrested, people got being killed. What this movement contributed to the movement is that the emotion and this intangible feeling, a shared emotion, that's also share hope that they actually could break the fear. If someone died, we could. The bravery of actually kind of help being spread collectively, right? And then the network is big enough. Wasn't as the kafaya was just too small. And in the end, on weeks leading to Tahrir moments, you needed to connect with all kind of media, cell phones, word of mouth, pamphlets actually play a very important role as well. Cabs drivers are there among the people who spread the news. What we see also, the changing of narratives, right? From Anthem Mubarak, this is just, I will explain later, but, or not. This is just the discourse on the blogosphere. There is a changing from Kafaya moment, which is more abstract, so about democracy, human rights, to something tangible. After 2008, something like close to the everyday problem of Egyptian. Corruption, torture, that's a tangible, right? Concrete, sheer contention. And certainly Tunis brings something sharp on the whole things. This is not only about corruption, but also we want something changed. Bold demand, down Mubarak, down. But also there is a element of claim making. There is an ongoing claim on the street. Without connection from online to offline, nothing's gonna happen. People just click. But there is this historical momentum that's being built, right? And also there is a convergence of intermodality, how to connect from online. And also there is aspect globalizing the movement. You got Al Jazeera, and then you got this all Twitter is important, and then other media to gain international support, so they are protected from the brutality of the government. I'm actually got my last slide. So the actual role of social media is that it provided space for the establishment of human agency, right? The expansion of social network for collective action. First, it sustained the old network, right? But also, it facilitated the emergence of new network of oppositional actor. Also, it facilitated the brokerage of various actors that were not connected in offline setting. It helped the diffusion of contention beyond the inner circle. It helped to expand the network by enabling the connection of strong and weak ties, and it helped to globalize the movement. But activists also had to accommodate by identifying right issue. What kind of sphere contention that work? The meta-narrative, right? I have to transform the narrative. And I also have to identify symbolic representation to unite the emotion of the people. And ultimately, routinizing the connection of online and offline to claim power, to make use the cascading information from online to the street. So all of this have to be there. And we could see actually clearly that Egypt definitely, like the previous speaker has said, has more space, opportunities for this. If you see the chart, it's all ICT penetration, mobile penetration, and Tunisia and Egypt actually are more likely, right? Even if you look before, things are more likely. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Excuse me, everyone. I'm Troy Schneider with the New America Foundation. Before we let Andres move to the next panel, just a quick housekeeping note. Know that some of you have had trouble getting onto the wireless. We set up a second signal that you can access if you want. The signal is future tense, and the password is future tense 140. So for those of you who are getting bumped off, future tense and future tense 140. Thanks.
Thank you, Troy. We're going to move on chronologically and conceptually to our next discussion, which I think flows nicely from Merlina's presentation. And this is entitled How the Arab Spring Begat a Deadly Summer. So let me introduce our moderator for this discussion, Catherine Zoff. Catherine? Catherine is a Schwartz Fellow here at New America. She writes about women's rights, religion, and the Middle East. Catherine lived in Syria and Lebanon from 2004 and to 2007. Mostly in Damascus, and mostly writing for the New York Times and the Chronicle for Higher Education, which I've always been intrigued by. She's also worked at the Times Bureau in Baghdad in 2008. In recent months, you may have seen Catherine's byline in the New York Times because she was sort of pressed back into service to help yes, please, coordinate the Syrian coverage. Catherine is also working on a book on young women in the Arab world. And I now will pass the reins over to you, Catherine. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Andres. All right, so here today we have Aula Al-Rifai next to me is a Syrian youth activist. She was one of the organizers of the Syrian Opposition Conference that was held early last month in Antalya, Turkey, and she serves on the youth committee that was created at the conference. She and her family left Syria in September 2005 after her parents, who are themselves prominent Syrian dissidents, received death threats from Asif Shawkat, the brother-in-law of the Syrian president. The family received political asylum in the US. Aula is now a senior at the University of Maryland, where she's majoring in political science. Ahmed Al-Umran, in the middle, is a blogger from Saudi Arabia whose blog, Saudi Genes, is known for its incisive commentary on human rights, women's rights, and political issues in the Arab world. He began blogging in 2004 during his first year in college. He was awarded a scholarship to Columbia's journalism school and received his master's degree from the school in May. He's currently covering the Arab Spring for NPR, and he was recently named one of Foreign Policy magazine's Twitterati 100 list of most influential Twitterers. Foreign Policy called Ahmed the original Saudi blogger. And Andrew Tabler worked as a journalist in Egypt for 6 years and in Damascus for 7 years up until 2008. He co-founded Syria Today, a quarterly English language magazine on Syrian affairs. Andrew is presently a Next Generation Fellow at the Washington Institute, and his first book, In the Lion's Den, an eyewitness account of Washington's battle with Syria, will be published in September and can be pre-ordered on Amazon now. So thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.
Ahmed, I wanted to direct this first question to you. When we spoke the other day, I was a bit surprised to hear you say that before you started blogging in 2004, you didn't have much interest in politics. And I was very struck by this idea that rather than turning to social media out of an interest in political activism, that it was something about the discipline of blogging, about your engagement with social media itself that had raised your political awareness. And I wonder if perhaps you could describe your experience to us. And when you look at your generation of young people across the Arab world, do you feel that it's something about the medium itself, about the way people engage with social media that has helped to raise this generation's political aspirations?
Well, I think in my case in particular, it has a lot to do with the situation in Saudi Arabia itself, where you don't have a lot of politics, you don't have elections, you don't have civil society. People are not actually allowed to practice politics. And the way I grew up and the way I was raised, I didn't deal with politics. I was, it's not something that my father or my family was talking about. And it wasn't until I started blogging and I, got to know this online community of bloggers and activists, actually at the beginning outside Saudi Arabia, in Egypt and other countries, that I, started to learn more about politics, and I got interested in it. I started to write about it more and more, and it became like the focus of my blog. But I think, yeah, the internet and social media is, given this generation, a great outlet and a space where they can express themselves, where they can engage each other and talk about these issues that usually or typically will be hard to talk about in the public sphere. We usually talk about politics, but in private settings where, very few people that you trust that you will trust that you can talk with. But now it's all happening online to the public to see, and this kind of change is taking a while for people to kind of like understand, especially the older generation. Like my parents find it crazy that I'm, online talking about all these important issues without getting in trouble for it. Not that I didn't or other people didn't.
You
but
have gotten in trouble for it, as I understand.
Anybody who would actually dare to do that knows for sure that they're getting themselves into trouble. But for me and for many people, I think the case is, we know it's risky, but we also think it's worth taking the risk in this case, because reforming our countries and the future of our nation is something that is worth taking risk for.
Okay. Well, I was so struck by this, what you said about how this was a blog that you had initially started to practice your English, I think you mentioned, and that it was somehow the act of having foreigners write to you and explaining Saudi social issues to them that
I find it amazing that, when I started 7 years ago, I just started for fun and to practice my English. I never thought it would, I would still be doing that 7 years later. I didn't think anybody would care, actually, because, who cares really? I don't. But the thing about actually, no, when you start to care about politics and human rights, you can't stop. That's the thing. Once you start caring about that, no matter how frustrated, no matter how bad the situation is, you can't just sit back and say, you know what, I don't care about this country anymore. You can't. You will keep doing it. And I think this is not just the case for me. This is the case for many activists and bloggers in the region. Mm-hmm. They, once they start doing that, they can't just stop and leave it behind them.
Does your family still think you're going back to your pharmacy training?
No, probably not.
Not anymore. All right.
They just hope I don't go to jail. As long as I'm outside, they're fine.
Then that'll be just fine. Okay, Aula, I was very curious to hear your opinion, actually, on the same subject based on your experiences as a Syrian activist. In many ways, Syria is such an interesting test case for the effectiveness of social media, because there is no free, independent media in Syria. And until very recently, the Syrian government was banning foreign journalists from the country. So unlike the so-called Al Jazeera revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia, in Syria, all you had was social media. And I wonder if you feel that as a result, that Syrian activists had to use the medium differently, if they had to come up with more aggressive or creative strategies, than activists in other countries.
Certainly, yes, they have been very creative. Right now, because of the revolution, the only way to get the information out is through, the videos, and the people on the streets, the protesters, are using cell phones and, small cameras, and some of them are crossing the borders. For example, the people who were in Dara, I had the chance to meet some of them in Antakya conference in Turkey around 2 months ago, and they were crossing the borders to go to Jordan to download videos in internet cafes and come back and fight again, or be on the street and protest and risking their lives. So, of course, the social media is, unfortunately, the only way to get the information out of Syria right now. No, yes, as you said, there's no news network on the ground, can cover the news there, because the government is a corrupt regime, is banning, not making anybody go inside. And even like there was a Al Jazeera reporter who was imprisoned there. They imprisoned her because she tried to cover some news. So the social media is almost 100% what we are doing, or relying on to get the news out, to show the whole world that, yes, there is a revolution in Syria, it's peaceful protest, and it's a war on the people because the people have no weapons and the government is attacking them and surrounding cities with tanks and killing people and children and arresting, and on a daily basis, hundreds of protesters. So we are using Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, all of these social media, tools to help us get that, show the world that, please help us to get rid of this regime. We need support. Yeah,
sorry,
go ahead.
Interrupt you. I know. I wondered what it was like, at the conference in Turkey, suddenly meeting these people that you, as I understand it, you had only known via social media. Is that right?
Yes, it was a wonderful conference because it brought all the Syrians from all over the world, different countries, from the U.S., from Europe, from Arab countries, everybody who has been active, supporting the revolution. We had the chance to meet in Turkey, in Antalya, to gather there and meet face to face. Also, we had around 50 people from inside Syria. They escaped. They found ways to smuggle and get to Turkey to attend the conference. And many of them journalists and political activists and people who went on the street and were protesting. And many of them were shot. I saw several guys, unfortunately, with torture scars on their bodies, and one of them was shot in the leg while he was on the street, just saying peaceful protest. So these people are the ones who are doing this revolution, and they're doing a very important role. It's because of them all of this is happening, and because of them we are getting to know now that, oh, there is a revolution in Syria. Also, what was the other question? It's about. I think you were mentioning if, they're risking their lives and.
Have you heard? Are you still in touch with the ones who have returned to Syria?
Some of them returned to Syria. I forgot to say that. Yeah, some of them were brave enough to go back, get out of the country, be in Turkey, attend a conference, and meet all these people, and be on the TV with their faces, with their real names, and then go back again to Syria to protest. And I was shocked. I asked them, like, are you serious? You're going back? I mean, you have been arrested and tortured, and you want to go back again, and you have this opportunity to stay outside and do something different. And some of them stayed outside. Many of them went back and said, we feel that we need to be on the streets there, and that's our role, and that's our responsibility. And they're very brave.
Oh, it's amazing. Andrew, you've written a great deal about Syria's traditional opposition, the older Marxists and Arab nationalists and human rights activists in Damascus. And when we spoke about your recent trip to the region, you were describing to me how struck you were at the contrast between these established opposition figures, many of whom have been participating in dialogue with the Assad regime and who still feel that dialogue is probably the right course, and this entirely new, bold, and very, very young opposition movement that is taking shape. Places like the Antalya conference. Ella was describing that this young opposition has no patience for dialogue and are saying basically that President Assad has to go and then they'll figure out what comes next. And I guess I wonder, how do you think that social media has shaped the style of this new opposition movement? And I guess why have they been so much more effective than this older group who have had so many years to organize themselves? And
well, there are a number of reasons. I mean, first and foremost, the protests in Syria are being driven by demographics. primarily. You know, Syria had one of the highest population growth rates in the world in the 1980s and the 1990s, and that was primarily because during the height of the crackdown by the Assad regime, everybody stayed home. I mean, the economy contracted, and no, I mean, you know, the San Francisco earthquake effect over the course of over a decade. Okay, so all of these young people are hitting the job market now. They're extremely tech savvy, and they spend, because there isn't a formal opportunity to express themselves on the physical plane. They've gone to the virtual plane. So they're the ones who. So essentially, what we're seeing here is like a sort of the equivalent of the United States or in Western Europe of 1968. And there's been a lot of talk about it. Is this 1979? Is it 1989? No, it's mostly 1968. And what that's allowed to happen is that what social media is allowed to happen is for those people to communicate with each other and to share their ideas. And they are protesting. They first started protesting virtually, and then went out on to the streets. And they're the ones who are driving the protests, and combined with local leaders, local religious leaders and sheikhs. The established opposition in the country, the traditional ones you had mentioned, as well as the exiled opposition, is not primarily driving the protests. The exiled opposition, the activists, are helping the protesters who are on the ground. But unfortunately, the established opposition is a much older generation. They prefer the regime and the status quo because they have a lot invested with it, even though they've been imprisoned and harassed over the years. And the problem with the exiled opposition is that they all don't like each other. I mean, intensely. And it's been a big problem. Now, they've made a lot of progress in the last 2 months, mostly with a lot of pressure from guys on the ground who are saying, like, look, you need to focus on the Assad regime, not on each other. And so it's that youthful vibe that's coming through social media, which is transforming not only the country, but also the way the opposition is organizing against the Assad regime.
Were there conflicts at the Antalya conference, I wonder? And there weren't any visible
seriously,
kind of
I'll be really honest, not just because I went there, but it was a very, very cooperative environment, and everybody got along, and we were expecting to, conflicts, not conflicts, but arguments, like disagreeing on a few, things, because at the end of the conference, we had to give a final declaration, and of course, everybody has different opinions on what the final declaration should say. So yes, there were some, disagreeing on a few points, but at the end, we all agreed on this is, the regime has to go. Bashar Assad has to step down. His vice president takes the, rules the country for a temporary period of time until the, transition government, so it was great. To be honest, it was the best week I had in a long time. Yeah, it was really great.
But I didn't mean to suggest that I think Antalya was also a big step forward. But there is tension within, yes, and this is something that the local coordinating committees told me directly, that really there's a lot of tension. But that being said, I think everybody now, very clearly, like the Obama administration, sees that they do not have an interest in the Assad regime remaining in power. That this is really, for them it's a systemic issue. That the system inside of Syria can't contain the spirits and aspirations of the people inside of Syria. And they just do not, and when you talk with some of these young activists, many of who are based in Beirut, and who are 22 years old, make me feel very young or very, very old. They just see it as self-evident. They don't see why anybody would see it any differently.
I just want to add a very quick point about the entire conference. It was a support body for the revolution. Period. That's it. So just people gathered to support the revolution, and that's what every single person who went there, and the 31 people that got elected there. To take care of the political, or the follow-up of, and other meetings, and so it was just a support body for the revolution. We were not, representing anybody in Syria. The revolution itself on the street represents itself. We're just out, to support them, to help them, to go, for the youth committee. Since I'm a member in the youth committee right now, what we decided to do is that when everybody goes back to their country, they would lobby, they would protest, in front of the embassy, like we do a weekly protest here in Washington, D.C. since the first day of the revolution at the White House and the Syrian embassy here in downtown D.C. We go, you know, we meet with congressmen and women. We try to reach out. We try to go on the media. So that's our role, to support the people inside Syria.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I guess to go back in time a little bit, Aula, I was wondering at what point during the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia did you and other activists start to feel that like this could happen? This could happen in Syria.
Yes, of course.
Like, was there a turning point for you, or and you know, and how did you then begin, you know, laying the groundwork for?
When the Tunisian revolution started, I was like, I wasn't sure if something similar happen in Syria or not. Even after Mubarak stepped down in Egypt, it was a big surprise for Mubarak to step down, you know, like, oh my God, he'd really stepped down. But there's a difference between Tunisia, Egypt, and Syria, and you know, in terms of the revolution, in terms of the economy, in terms of the political situation, there are a lot of differences. So for me, when I was looking, you know, following the news, oh my God, I wish that sometime in the future, I was saying to myself, Syria, something would happen in Syria. But I wasn't very optimistic until I saw the very first protest on the streets of Damascus on
tiny,
March.
Right?
Yes, it was tiny. But when they started saying, "You thieves, thieves," to the government, I was like, yes, something is happening, because we've been under dictatorship for 48 years. It's more than what, you know, more than the president of Tunisia was ruling. He was just for like 30 or something, or no, 20, and in Egypt around 30 years. We've been under, you know, dictatorship rule, same family for 48 years. So, and the economy is very, very bad, and you know, the situation in Syria is much more worse than in Egypt than in Tunisia. So I knew that at some point the people are gonna, you know, say, hello, we are here, we need our rights. So, but I wasn't very optimistic until it started. And when it started, it became bigger and bigger and bigger. And right now, the people want to topple the regime. And we never really, it was a surprise, but it was very, it's incredible right now to see how, I wish I was, you know, able to go there and be on the streets with everybody else. And yeah, we need freedom. This regime, no, there's no way for reform. We don't believe them anymore. No, we don't trust this president. I don't consider him my president. He wasn't even elected legally. So yes.
97.25%
yeah,
vote.
miraculous.
How can you argue with that? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
In a referendum. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, if we're talking about what it's like to, you know, watch these Al Jazeera revolutions from afar, I know you were at Columbia while you were watching all this, but I'd love to, I know you're in touch with a lot of Saudi activists back home, and I'd, you know, sort of love to hear your thoughts on how this, you know, this is being viewed from the Gulf.
I think that, as Wala said, when things started, it was kind of like, took everyone by surprise. Nobody saw that coming, and you know, when things started in Tunisia and then in Egypt, you know, from what I have seen online, from the people that I talked to, there was a lot of excitement in Saudi and the Gulf in general about what was happening in the region, because, you know, the people in the Gulf, like the rest of the people in the region, they also want democracy and freedom and justice, and they were, you know, they were happy and excited to see that change take place in Tunisia and Egypt. But, you know, I think some people got a little bit too excited, thinking that, oh, it's a domino effect now, you know, Saudi Arabia is next. And, you know, I think that this kind of excitement was a little bit premature. Like, people were drinking the revolution Kool-Aid and thinking that, you know, if it happens there, it could happen here any day. But I think, you know, yes, some of the circumstances are similar. As Andrew said, the demographics, the young population, the unemployment, the lack of freedom and dignity and justice, all of that is similar. But also, each country has a different dynamic and a different situation. And, you know, monarchies in the Gulf has much more money to quell these revolutions and stop them from happening. As we have seen with Saudi Arabia, for example, it wasn't just that the Saudi government was supporting Mubarak. They welcomed Ben Ali after he was ousted, and they were also getting involved in Bahrain and Yemen and other places. So they were not just trying to stop the revolution from reaching their country. They're also kind of like resisting this wave of change in other places. And this is one part of it. And the other part of it is, as I said, by and large, people are still not politically aware to the degree that allow them to do that, to demand their rights and ask for freedom and justice like the rest of the region. So, we are seeing the first signs of this spirit happening online. We're seeing the first signs of people actually publicly showing their dissent and their opposition to what's happening.
You mean
but
Facebook posts?
On Facebook, on Twitter, and in the blogosphere. But it will take some time before this public display of dissent online actually moves to the street.
I was sitting with you at lunch in Riyadh about this time last year, and you were describing to me how you called it the year of the campaigns last year. You said that people had gotten really into these petition campaigns to change different things, and were that there weren't really live meetings, but that I guess I wonder whether you see that as the first baby steps towards this political ability to organize politically that you were talking about.
Definitely, I think the internet is helping this kind of young community of activists to work together, communicate, get to know each other, and work on the issues that matter to them. And part of it, as you said, is collaborating on petitions and what they can do in the space that is available to them, because it's not easy because it is illegal to actually protest on the street in Saudi Arabia. Then the internet is kind of like the arena where these people and activists can go there and organize and collaborate and work together towards these issues. Now, how effective is that? How the government is responding to this? It's hard because if you mainly work online, and the government is still kind of like not very responsive to what's happening, because like in many other parts of the Arab world, you have a big divide between the population and the leadership. In Saudi Arabia, you have a very young population, probably 60% are under 30 or 25. Meanwhile, you have leaders who are in their 80s and 70s, and these two generations are not speaking the same language. So it's really hard to kind of like, from the government perspective, they think that they're trying to reform and change things, but what they're doing is not matching the aspiration of the younger generation who really wants much more.
Could you give an example of the sort of thing that they consider to be reform, or?
Well, I mean, after what happened in Tunisia, we've seen the government offer, financial aid packages and unemployment benefits, and these small municipal elections, thinking that we're doing something, we're giving something to the people. But what we have seen people demand for in these petitions that you talked about, they were talking about much bigger things. They were talking about a constitutional monarchy and the rule of law and free elections and democracy and equality between the genders. So there is a huge difference between what reformers and these young activists want and what the government is offering them.
I was looking the other day at figures on internet penetration in the Arab world, and probably not surprisingly, the Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and the other countries in the Gulf region have some of the highest levels, much higher than in Egypt or Jordan or Syria or even Tunisia, and yet except for Bahrain, we haven't. So it'll be interesting to see what comes next. Andrew, I wonder. Do you think that this wave of revolution in the Arab world will have a lasting positive impact, or is there any part of you that worries that it could make things more unstable or even violent?
Well, it already has made
yeah,
things
it has made
unstable.
things more.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Setting
inevitable. It's inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's what we're looking at in the Arab world is something that, you know, those of us who spend a lot of time there, and I think all Arabs understand and beyond, is what we're looking at there is systemic failure. And you know, okay, so I guess if you live in the region for a long time, you're allowed to roll out Orientalist analogies, but it essentially gets down to the genie in the bottle. Okay, sorry, cut me a break. But it basically comes down to this: for the past couple of decades or even longer, people's lives have been transformed. Globalization has penetrated the Arab world like never before. You have the internet now, which allows people to communicate, just like it allows us to communicate. And people's aspirations and dreams and so on now constitute that genie, and it's huge. And there's a lot of substance to it. Previously, it was always under the radar, so to speak. And these regimes have not changed the size of the bottle. We call it here stability in policy circles.
I'm sorry, what?
Stability,
Oh, yes.
yes. And what it is that, well, these regimes just, you know, they are as they are, and they're very stable, so therefore they're worth betting on. It's an important component, for example, to the peace process-based strategy that the Obama administration pursued with the Assad regime for 2.5 years until it came undone as a result of the protests. So now it's very hard to argue that regimes which do not fundamentally change over time and remain static are indeed stable, and they're not stable. Now, what's happening in Syria will continue. It's going to go on for a long time. It will become much more bloody, I'm afraid. Could it become sectarian? Yes. But the Assad regime is degrading. It's degrading for its own reasons. It's just unable to harness or to deal with the changing realities inside of the country. And I think, you know, it took a long time for the Obama administration to come around to this understanding, because first of all, it's very hard to get information in Syria and to verify it. But also, just look at Bashar al-Assad's response to the protests so far. I mean, did anybody stay up or get up early in the morning for that March 30th speech, which you were told to anticipate? David Ignatius wrote a piece saying that it was going to be some kind of like white revolution, or he was going to pull a revolution on himself. He didn't promise anything. He didn't implement anything. Now, he has made some changes along the way, but now the protesters' demands aren't about corruption. They're not about these kind of changes. Now it's about, hey, Bashar, you got to go. It's very hard to
It's a matter
bridge.
of weeks, really.
Yeah. And that's been a big transformation, and that's the reason why you've seen the change in Obama administration policy over the last 48 hours, publicly, that is.
Okay. I guess, Ahmed, do you feel that? I mean, do you feel that you know, the hereditary monarchies in the Gulf are more immune? Do you think that their rule is, you know, sort of more in line with the aspirations of people?
No one is immune. No one is, you know, they would like to think they're immune, but no one is immune. And, you know, as we said before, the reality on the ground of demographics and the other reasons that triggered this wave of revolutions in the rest of the region also exist in the Gulf. The difference is that the Gulf monarchies have the oil revenues to use to kind of like delay that change from happening. But, you know, you cannot, you know, money is a short-term solution, okay? These issues need fundamental solutions. You know, you cannot deal with them with money, and at some point money will run out, okay? The oil revenues are not going to be there forever. So the only way out for these monarchies to actually, I'm not going to say resist this wave of change, but let's say to adapt with it and deal with it, is by changing themselves and maybe becoming constitutional monarchies and giving people more rights and give people more chance to participate and be part of the process of making decisions and governing themselves. And so far, you know, most of these regimes, all of them, do not seem very eager to actually do that. They try to find another way to deal with it, as we have seen in Bahrain, for example. So they're not immune, but they would like to think they have time, and they're buying time with the money that they have.
Well, I wonder if there are any questions for the panelists from the audience. There.
Hi, my name is Adam Paramadi. I work on the stream at Al Jazeera English. We've received lots of great video coming out of Syria, and Ahmed, thanks for being on our show earlier this week. We've received lots of great video coming out of Syria showing the activists in the street and protesters, but it's been very difficult for us to talk to real voices on the ground, bloggers, people tweeting. We had one, I think, very prolific incident. The gay girl in Damascus turned out to be a hoax. So Aula, being a girl from Syria, I was wondering maybe you could shed some light for us on the difficulties that people face accessing net or getting their message out in Syria specifically.
Well, since, of course, there's a lot of difficulties. Opposition inside Syria are hiding from place to another because they're, going to their houses and asking for them on a daily basis. They want to arrest them. So it's really, really difficult. And when people go on the media or television, bloggers or activists or opposition figures, they're you won't be able to talk to them for a long time because they have to hide somewhere to talk to you, and they're very risking their lives. Internet cafes we're saying that the internet is helping us to get the information out, but also the government is monitoring the internet. It's not a favor from the regime that they're keeping the internet. They shut down the internet for a little bit, and then they went back and made it available to everybody, but they are monitoring people that way more. When you go to internet cafes, it's a little expensive to get internet at your house in Damascus or in Syria, in any city. So most of the young generation, they go to internet cafes, and when you go to internet cafes, you have to give full information about you, like your address, your full name, where you live, your phone number, and everything, so they can monitor you. And you can't go access all websites that you would like to access to. And if they feel something going on, they would right away arrest you from maybe that internet cafe. So it's very difficult. It is really very difficult. Some activists are doing is they're using, especially the ones who live on the borders, they're using, Turkish lines, cell phones, or Jordanians or Lebanese sometimes to talk to you, to the news networks, and say that, oh, this is happening in Syria, but this is what's going on. So, but it's extremely difficult. It's becoming much more difficult every day. Yeah.
The lady in the green.
Thank you so much for this great discussion. I was wondering what particularly the speakers from Syria and Saudi see as a role that the United States, either government or private sector or civil society, can play in all this, and particularly what's the perception among the people who are out there in the streets about the United States and what they would like to see done. I mean, I think in the case of Saudi, where we're allies and we honor you here and yet we support your government, so I'm wondering how you see that. And in Syria, there was the action of the American ambassador going to Hama that seemed to have a very positive effect. Should that happen again? And what's the overall view? Thank you.
Ahmed, do you want to go first?
But at first I don't speak for people in Saudi, because I don't think that I represent anyone or don't represent anyone but myself. And I think that when it comes to the role of the U.S. government or what the U.S. government could do, there isn't much that they can do, actually, because change must come from within and from the people themselves, who should demand these rights and work to get them. So it's really hard for me to say what the American government or the American people or companies should do. That's their own thing. But I think in the end it's up to the people to decide what they want and how they should go about it. The only thing is, if the American foreign policy, the American foreign policy, people keep talking about how the United States government will always stand for human rights and for freedom of expression and freedom on the internet. And if they should make sure that their policy decisions are in line with these principles that they keep repeating and talking about, and not put the interest that might contradict with these principles first.
Paula?
Yeah, well, sorry, you mentioned that how do we, if we would like the Ambassador Ford, when he visited the city of Hama last week, yes, we saw, if any of you saw the videos, the Ambassador Ford and the French ambassador, both of them were in Hama for the protest, to be there on Friday, because the Syrian tanks were surrounding the city of Hama, and they were planning for a big slaughter, a massacre that day. But the people on the streets in Hama, they welcomed both of the ambassadors with roses and olive branches. While we saw in Damascus the regime thugs throw stones and eggs and tomatoes on the American embassy and the French embassy, and even there are some injured people at the French embassy, I guess. So we see the difference. Yes, so the protesters inside Syria want international support. They want the American support, they want the European support, the whole world support to get rid of this regime. What the regime is saying, oh, you want the Americans to come inside and do what they did, like what they did in Iraq? No, we are against military intervention. That's not what we want. We want international support. What I mean by that is to take them to international criminal court, the regime, the Bashar al-Assad and his brother, and Asif Shaukat, the head of the security intelligence, and to freeze their assets and to, legally prosecute them. So we're not saying that, oh, we need American intervention, come inside and help us. No, that's not right. But we're very happy to see Ambassador Ford and the French ambassador to be there. And that's the only way that we were, to prove that this protest is peaceful and there's no violence from the protesters. It's a peaceful protest, and I said it's a war against the people, because the people don't have weapons, and the regime has all of the weapons, and they're relying on Iranian army as well and tanks to kill all the the peaceful protesters and children, even 13 years old and and younger. The very first couple of students who wrote on the walls of their school, Yasqut al-Nizam, which means down with dictatorship or down with the regime. They were 5, 6 years old, and they arrested them and took them to prison. And they did horrible things to them, and they gave them dead bodies to their family. So, yeah.
I mean, just to add one bit, I think that the American foreign policy is walking a very fine line here, because even when simply they announce their support for these general principles, activists on the ground has to deal with it, because it usually has a negative effect, as we have seen. For one example is the woman driving campaign in Saudi Arabia, when Hillary Clinton came out and said she supports the right of Saudi women to drive. The conservatives in the country were quick to paint all these activists as westernized and being supported by the US, and they had to deal with that. So it's really difficult and tricky.
Andrew,
I would just add that it's very important that our actions don't play into the hands of the Syrian regime's spokespeople and spin doctors. I mean, you don't want to help Imad Mustafa out, okay, in any way, shape, or form. And the reason why Ambassador Ford went to Hama is because the Syrian authorities have acted in a completely appalling way. They were preparing to move into the city. This was not, as Syria comment suggested, some kind of play where Ford got to go to Hama to save his hide here in Washington from criticisms from the Republicans, and Assad moved the protesters in to go to scale the embassy walls to save face in Syria. That's ridiculous.
Yes, that's
American policy is not based on that. American policy is based on trying to promote freedom of expression and freedom of assembly inside of Syria, and that's the reason why Robert Ford went. And so it's very, but I think I totally agree with you. It's walking this fine line because the regime and its supporters here in the United States would like nothing more to say, you see, the protests are all about the Americans and the Zionists and everything else. No, it's not about that. Obviously, it's not about that. Okay, it is about these systems being unable to accommodate their people's wishes and dreams in any kind of way that doesn't lead to violence and mass shootings and torture.
Well, I know that there was some feeling among the opposition that that perhaps the U.S. should withdraw its ambassador. Has that changed? That there should be a kind of a gesture on that scale, but it seems that
we want sanction on the country, sanctions, of course, but I saw that it was a very smart idea from the American government to keep the ambassador right now to be able to visit and report. Well, throw out the Syrian ambassador here. Yes, I'm with that. And now there is a very, the FBI is investigating because they are spying on us, on our protests here in downtown DC. They're taking videos and threatening the families back home. So there is, if they can prove that, the Syrian ambassador could be thrown out easily.
The Syrian ambassador was demarched last week for this activity, for monitoring the Syrian opposition in the United States with cell phone videos and so on. And these, I mean, and there are many stories like this. It's not simply an embassy that's openly advocating for Syria here. There's a lot of mukhabarat monitoring that goes on from that embassy. That's just a fact of life.
This gentleman here in the second row.
My name is Alex from the Project on Middle East Democracy. I just was wondering, Ahmed, if you could talk a little bit more about the women driving protests in Saudi Arabia, maybe its context within the rest of the opposition, burgeoning opposition movement under, online, and I'd be interested in hearing what you had to say.
Well, the first women driving protest actually happened in 1990 during the Gulf War at the time, and during that protest, 47 women drove their cars and they were arrested, and they were basically publicly denounced, and they were fired from their jobs, and they were banned from travel, and they had to suffer through the years during the 90s. And now, after with everything that is happening in the region, all these revolutions are inspiring a new generation of women to revive the issue of driving, and that's why they decided earlier this year to set a date where women in the country will just start driving everywhere. It wasn't a mass protest. It was just an announcement saying, okay, from now on, women should just go and drive and see what happens. And what happened on June 17, the day that was announced for the driving, is that more than about 100 women actually drove around the country, and it went largely peacefully. The government did not arrest anyone. They stopped 2 women, and 1 woman got a ticket, but beside that, it went pretty peacefully. So women actually kept their campaign, and now they're basically saying this is ongoing. We will keep driving and see how the government will deal with it. The government has found themselves in this weird situation where they can't really do much because legally, there is nothing in the law that bans women from driving, but at the same time, there is resistance from the conservatives who think this change might trigger bigger changes. And we will see how if and when the government come out with an official position on this, because so far they have been really silent on it. But some people say that the government tolerance for the driving protest on June 17 and what followed might signal that a change might be coming soon, and the government might announce before the end of the year that the women driving issue is no more and will be solved once and for all.
I think we have time for one very quick question. Maybe this lady in turquoise? Here.
Can the panelists talk about the most effective ways in which online networks move into the real world and were translated into mobilization and street action, and maybe also some of the failures? Thank you.
I think that the woman driving thing is a really good example because it started mainly on Facebook and Twitter, and this group of women basically campaigned online, exclusively online, for about 2 months before that started. And You know, some people at first suggested that this will fail because it's public. Because it's public, that means the government can stop it. That means that anything could happen to it. But these women have actually used Facebook and Twitter very effectively, because they campaigned for this for 2 months, and then on the day of protest, what they did, every time one woman drove her car, she would shoot a video and upload it online, and it will be on Twitter like in 2 hours or 3 hours. So it was really effective in this case, and they keep doing that. So, you know, it can be really useful, especially in a place where, you know, freedom of assembly does not exist, and people have to organize this way to make things happen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. And I think we are out of time, but thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, that was great. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Rebecca McKinnon, who is a senior Schwartz Fellow here at the New America Foundation. Rebecca has provided New America and many of you perhaps with a great deal of intellectual leadership on this subject in terms of defining and staking out what internet freedom means, both domestically and abroad. Assistant Secretary Posner referenced earlier the Global Network Initiative, which Rebecca McKinnon founded, as well as Global Voices has also been raised here today, which is also founded by Rebecca McKinnon. So we are very proud that Rebecca has made her home with us here at New America in providing this leadership. She's currently working on a book called Consent to the Networked, which will be out early next year, and I think will be a culmination of a lot of Rebecca's groundbreaking work on this subject. We're sort of short on biographies here to keep things moving, but as many of you probably know, Rebecca first got her start in journalism on the broadcast side. She was CNN's bureau chief in Beijing from 1998 to 2001, and in Tokyo from 2001 to 2003. She's done a world of tremendous things, and we're lucky to have her today to really give what's our keynote talk on myths, realities, and inconvenient truths of the internet. I should also note that Rebecca, because she's in such demand, rushed here today from London, where she gave a TED talk on a similar subject yesterday. So we have to give her bonus points for that. Rebecca, thank you.
Thanks very much, Andres. Thanks. Because I just showed up, I didn't get a chance to test anything, so let's just hope the audio works and the video works and everything else. And just one clarification, I didn't single-handedly found the Global Network Initiative. It was sort of a group effort, but, you know, thank you. I don't want to take more credit than I deserve. But I want to start out with a bit of history for some those people in the room who were born after 1980. This is really ancient history, but at least there are some of us who were born earlier than that. But there's some very dominant, I think, sort of myths and beliefs, particularly in the American collective psyche. And I think this ad that ran in 1984 that was inspired by George Orwell that Apple ran really encapsulates, I think, the way in which we like to think about technology, market, capitalism, and freedom. So I'll just play this excerpt here and hopefully it will work.
Is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
So this is a really dominant kind of meme in our collective, particularly American consciousness, but I would say the democratic West more generally, that technology created by innovative companies is just going to set everybody free, just by virtue of being put out there. And I think that's one reason why the kind of meme of Facebook revolution was so captivating so immediately in the media. And this is the original photo that was taken by NBC's Richard Engel. He uploaded it onto the internet, and immediately it was all over the internet, all over the media, and generally translated as "Thank you, Facebook." But actually, a local blogger in Tahrir posted a photo of the same guy with her translation, and she's a native Egyptian Arabic speaker. Her translation says, I don't know if you can read this here, but she types, the sign says, "Thank you, Egypt's Facebook youth. Standing strong, we will not leave." So thanking Facebook and thanking Egypt's Facebook youth are two somewhat different things, and I think that echoes what a number of speakers earlier today have kept continuously reinforced, that it wasn't Facebook that brought on the revolution, that the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia did not spring immaculately from Facebook and Twitter, that this was really the result, as Sami Ben Gharbia, who spoke earlier today, he likes to say it took a decade to break down the fear through a great deal of activism, both online and off. And similarly, when you talk to Egyptian activists, they'll tell you the same thing, that they've been working for a decade on this. And as the previous speaker talked about the Kifaya movement and so on, and a lot of the people who are very active in Tahrir have been going at it since long before Facebook and Twitter existed. Now, certainly the technology helped, but it was also, I think, as we've been hearing over and over again, a product of a great deal of work by dedicated people for a long period of time. Now, this is a very interesting map. This is a world map of social networks as of June 2011. And the blue here is the Facebook empire, the empire of Facebookistan, you could call it, or something. And Facebook has indeed, become the dominant social network in many parts of the world. But you also see some borders persisting in cyberspace, and the reasons are very interesting. Now, Brazil, the dominant social network is Orkut, for reasons you're really going to have to ask Brazilians about, their kind of unique cultural and social reasons, and linguistic reasons. And Japan uses primarily Mixi, which is, again, for cultural and linguistic reasons primarily that are fairly unique to Japan. But then you see China, Vietnam, and a number of the former Soviet states. China, the dominant social network, the #1 social network is something called Qzone. How many people in this room have heard of Qzone? Yeah, not too many. And in Russia, it's Vkontakte. And then in some of the other former Soviet states, it's also a Russian social network called Odnoklassniki, which is kind of like a classmate thing. And so what's interesting, particularly with China and Vietnam and the former Soviet states, is you have a trend where the relationship between the local social networking companies, in Vietnam it's also something called Zing, which is local, the relationship between the local social networking companies and the government is actually serving to constrain the empowering potential of this technology in ways that are worth paying attention to. So China, of course, everybody's familiar with the idea of the Great Firewall of China, the system of filtering or blocking that prevents people who don't know how to use circumvention technology from accessing Facebook or Twitter or other global websites that the Chinese government has decided to block. That's only part of the story. The other part of the story is what is a set of policies that the Chinese government likes to refer to as self-discipline, which in more plain English means basically subcontracting censorship and surveillance to private sector internet companies. And so what goes on, this is actually an award ceremony. I sat way in the back of this auditorium at this award ceremony in 2009, where the Internet Society of China presented a self-discipline award to the top 20 companies that were doing the best job of policing their users. And Robin Li, CEO of Baidu, China's dominant search engine, was recipient of one of these awards. And of course, if you don't abide by the government demands and rules, you're not allowed to have a business license. And if you're a foreign company, you know, you can't operate in China. And so just to kind of visualize a little bit how this works, this is google.com if you do a Chinese language search for the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. So this is like on the international google.com, you do the search and you get the tanks, you get bloody pictures of bodies and so on, you get what you would expect. If you do the same search on Baidu, you get nothing. You get a message saying that no such results exist because it's been so heavily censored. And that's being done by Baidu itself using technology it's developed at the behest of the government. Now, Google, when it was operating in China, of course, it pulled its search engine out of China, decided to stop censoring last year. But during the period of time from 2006 until early 2010, when it was operating in China, it was trying to split the difference with Google.cn. So they would give some results, but not all results. So when you did a search, you got results of some things from Tiananmen Square and some things from a historical massacre called the Nanjing Massacre during the Sino-Japanese War, but you don't actually get pictures of tanks and bloody bodies from Tiananmen 1989. So you kind of split the difference. But Google's attempt to split the difference wasn't enough for the Chinese government, and they eventually felt, in addition to the fact that they were being subject to hacker attacks and other kinds of problems, they decided that the pressure on them to censor increasingly more and more no longer made it worth staying in China, and they withdrew last year. So, and here is Baidu's one of Baidu's social networks. They have a blogging platform in addition to search engine, and they've got a number of other different services in addition to search. And this is an experiment I did a while back where or last year, I tried to post an article I created a blog. I tried to post an article about Liu Xiaobo, who won the Nobel Peace Prize last year. I couldn't even publish the article. It prevented me from publishing. So it's not just about blocking content. It's not about just making it hard to reach content, but you can still find it if you can circumvent the firewall. It's about keeping stuff off the internet completely. So in the simplified Chinese Mandarin internet that is hosted on computer servers inside China, there's just certain conversations that are much harder to find because they get deleted. And there are weekly and sometimes daily directives coming from the government to all these companies saying, here's a list of the types of subjects you need to look out for and the, certain people you need to keep an eye on and so on and so forth. So in places like China, what actually happens is that while I call this networked authoritarianism because people do feel much freer than they used to, they have a lot larger space to talk about many more things than they could before the internet happened. You can even sometimes expose corrupt behavior of local officials, and there is quite a lot of lively debate and discussion going on the Chinese internet, but it's still prescribed. It's still impossible to use Chinese blogs, to use the Chinese equivalent of Twitter to start a protest. It gets nipped in the bud. The people are easily tracked via the companies who are logging their IP addresses and sometimes require that they register with ID numbers and so on. And people get visits from the police saying, we understand you've been blogging or trying to blog about such and such, and it's not very advisable. So that's one way that it's contained, while at the same time people feel optimistic because they feel they can still do more than they could in the past. So it's a way that the government is enabled to allow for more steam to blow off, allow for people to talk about very local and specific things, but as soon as somebody tries to use social media to say, hey, this problem in this one province, this is a result of a systemic failure. We need democracy. We can't solve this one official at a time. That's when, boom, everything starts getting deleted and people start getting calls from the police. In Russia, they don't generally block websites, and sort of direct internet censorship is is very light. But what does happen is a great deal of both surveillance as well as intimidation. So this is a website called Rospil. It's an anti-corruption website started by Alexei Navalny, who's quite famous and been interviewed in a lot of Western media. And earlier this spring, a very troubling thing happened. A number of people who had given donations to Rospil to help support its anti-corruption investigations suddenly started receiving these strange phone calls from people posing as journalists, but clearly weren't journalists, who turned out somebody did some digging and found out that a number of these people were definitely members of a nationalist right-wing youth party, and that these people had detailed transactional information about the financial transactions they'd made to Rospil and other things that it turned out, with a little more digging by, I believe it was BBC Russia, found out that this information had been obtained by some Russian security agents who had then handed the information over to the members of this nationalist youth party, who then went and harassed the donors to this website. Now, this is one very subtle way to chill the internet's potential to enable people to use the internet to hold government to account. And so you also have an interesting situation, let's say in Egypt. So we had a revolution in Egypt. Of course, there's still the challenge of, will Egypt succeed in building a democracy? And this, on the left here, is a picture taken by an activist who was part of the storming of Egyptian state security headquarters back in March, where a bunch of activists kind of went in, and the fleeing agents left behind a lot of shredded documents, but they also left behind a lot of intact documents that they hadn't had a chance to destroy or remove. And some activists found their own files, and those files contained transcripts of their cell phone text messages, detailed email exchanges, logs of their email exchanges, even logs of Skype chats, all kinds of different records of their digital activities in great detail. And another activist actually found a contract from a Western company for the sale of technology that would assist in this type of surveillance. And this type of technology is being sold by a number of companies originating both in North America and in Europe to governments all over the Middle East. And this has been documented by a number of people now in the activist community in various countries. So this is a problem that people around the authoritarian world are facing, that a lot of the surveillance and also censorship technology is coming from, these great Western capitalist technology companies that are supposed to be freeing us, according to Apple's ad, and according to our collective kind of psyche. The Open Net Initiative did a report earlier this year called West Censoring East, in which they traced all of the companies, primarily in North America, that are selling censorship software to governments around the Middle East. And this is, a lot of this software, it's kind of like, it's the same software that companies use to keep their employees from playing with Facebook during working hours, or to keep their kids in schools from looking at porn or something. But that same technology is then sold to authoritarian regimes, and it's used to block entire national networks and to control political speech. And while some companies are trying to limit its political use, other companies, we're selling security software, we can't control how it's being used, is what you hear in response. So again, a question of, are we sort of the great West kind of liberating the unfree peoples? It's much more complicated than that. So we now have a world where the relationship between citizens and government is increasingly mediated through this thing called the internet, which is comprised mainly of services and platforms and networks that are owned and operated by the private sector in one way or another. And there's a lot of time being spent these days arguing, okay, is the internet going to help the good guys more or the bad guys more? I would suggest that that argument is something of a waste of time. Of course, it's going to empower whoever is most skilled in using the technology and who best understands the internet in relation to their adversary, whoever their adversary happens to be. And what I would suggest is the most important question we need to be focusing on right now is how do we ensure that the internet evolves in a way that favors the citizen and serves the citizen rather than favoring other powerful entities, that we make sure that it evolves in a way that maximizes the good and empowering nature of the technology and minimizes the way in which it can be used for control. As Sami Ben Gharbia mentioned earlier on today, censorship returned to Tunisia in May, and this is a block page that some activists took a screenshot of about what you see when you try to access certain Facebook pages that the transitional government has decided potentially might incite violence and need to be blocked. And there's been a big debate about this in Tunisia and whether this is a good or bad thing. Slim Amamou, who was a blogger who'd been jailed under Ben Ali and who had joined the transitional cabinet, actually resigned his cabinet post in protest. And the members of the Nawat community and so on all tend to agree with him that this return of censorship is a dangerous thing. But there are many other people who've been sort of arguing with them on Twitter and elsewhere that actually saying, you know, look, we need democracy and free speech and all this, but there's some speech that's out of bounds. Some speech is just going to incite hatred and violence, and we need to control it. But the question is, of course, who should be empowered to control the speech, and how do you prevent them from abusing their power? And the fact of the matter is, we don't have really good answers in democracies to that question, oftentimes. And this is South Korea, and South Korea is often kind of used as an example of the empowering nature of the internet. It's the first country where you actually had a president whose election was determined by activism through the citizen media website, Oh My News, back in 2002, late 2002. But in South Korea, there's been some troubling trends that in a way kind of serve as a warning and an example of the difficulties that we face even in democracies. In July 2005, there was what's been called the dog poop girl incident. This is a young woman who allowed her dog to defecate on the subway, and she refused to clean it up, and everybody got outraged. And somebody took a video of this on the subway, as people often do with social media these days. Well, as a result, she was hunted down. She had to get plastic surgery because she engaged in a bit of unseemly behavior, socially not very responsible, but she was harassed and hunted down to the point where she couldn't show her face in Korea. She had to get plastic surgery in order to continue to live in Korea. And there's a lot of concern in Korea and in many societies about the use of the internet by, vigilantes and others, and cyberbullying and harassment, and a lot of voters calling on elected politicians to do something about this. All these bad people doing bad things on the internet, you have to stop them. And so what South Korea did is they implemented a law where websites with more than a certain number of users require that people have to register their real name and ID number with the social media company that they're using. And so there was a famous incident in 2009 where this guy who was blogging under the pen name Minerva, and he was basically writing economic analyses and critiques of the South Korean economic policies, he got arrested for spreading false rumors on the internet. He'd been writing pseudonymously with a pseudonym in public, but his his social media platform, of course, knew exactly who he was and what his address was, and the police asked them for it and gave it to him. And he was jailed for 5 months. He was eventually acquitted, but that case had a real chilling effect on people, again, who want to use the internet to really go up against kind of the establishment media that's many people in Korea feel is a little too much of a lapdog, and so on. Because even if they end up getting justice in the end, their life will still get ruined. So this is an interesting cautionary tale, and in fact, there's been other complaints made by civil liberties groups in Korea about what people feel is the misuse of government authority over social networks and internet service providers and so on to curb protest activity that human rights groups believe is legitimate. And so, again, these laws were passed because voters in a democracy wanted the government to do something about genuinely bad people doing bad and irresponsible things. So even in democracies, we often don't have the right answers. And in the UK, too, you have issues with censorship. And in fact, a few years ago, part of Wikipedia got blocked for a brief period of time in the United Kingdom because this particular page, Scorpions album, with a nude girl on it, was basically put on a block list by a child protection group that internet service providers were supposed to block. And similarly, you had a situation in 2009 where the Chinese government instituted this green dam software that was kind of requiring that everybody put these filters on computers. Well, there was an anti-pornography group in the UK who were saying, hey, that's a really good idea, we should do the same thing. So, there are a lot of political currents in democracies that may result in policies that have unintended consequences we need to think about. And so in the UK as well, there's something called the Digital Economy Act that's going to put more onus on private intermediaries to police citizen behavior, primarily with the purpose of preventing file sharing and copyright violation. But again, this question about, are you creating an unaccountable layer that is susceptible to abuse and mission creep? And of course, in France, you have similar, I'm going to go faster because I'm running out of time, where, Sarkozy says, governments have to regulate these platforms, but then he goes and champions what's known as the 3 strikes law, which would disconnect people from the internet after 3 violations of file sharing, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Free Expression has condemned this as an excessive and disproportionate punishment that will infringe on people's right to communication and information access. And a lot of the mechanisms are, pointed to by authoritarian regimes as saying, well, we're just, following international standard practice. And, in the United States, whatever you think of Julian Assange, there's concern about the fact, even by people who aren't big fans of his, that Amazon Web Hosting dropped WikiLeaks as a client soon after receiving complaints from U.S. Senator Joe Lieberman and others, despite the fact that WikiLeaks was never even charged, let alone convicted of any kind of crime. And of course, there's been a lot of controversy and continues to be in the United States about the way in which U.S. Law enforcement and anti-terror authorities are accessing communications and whether there is sufficient due process and accountability built into that, and a lot of debate about the Patriot Act, which I've actually heard Chinese officials cite as an example of how they're just following standard international practice. So we have this problem in democracies, and I promise I'm wrapping up soon. We have this problem even in democracies where we haven't really worked out how best to balance security and child protection and protecting businesses and so on the one hand, with protecting civil liberties and free expression on the other in our digital networks. We have a basic sense of how to do it in the physical world, in terms of you know, how you trade off between law enforcement and civil liberties. We don't achieve it perfectly, but at least we have an ideal of how these kind of interests should be balanced in democratic institutions. But we don't have a good sense of how to do this in a digitally networked, globally networked environment. And it's really incumbent on democracies to lead the way in figuring this out. Otherwise, it's going to sound kind of hollow, and I think you've heard this from a number of people today, that, you know, if the US and other democracies need to practice what they preach. But I think it's also true that government doesn't get it right just kind of on its own, despite the really, I think, genuinely good intentions of officials like Secretary Posner, Assistant Secretary Posner, who was here today. I got to get everybody's title right. And so on. I think there's a lot of very good, well-intended people in a lot of democracies. But unless we have a broad citizen movement, you're not going to change corporate behavior, and you're not going to get intelligent government policies across the board. And the pressure really does need to come from the public. You didn't get intelligent environmental policy to the extent that we have it. You didn't get companies to stop hiring 10-year-olds, you know, just because CEOs and government officials figured it was the right thing to do. It took decades of activism and public pressure. And the only way we're going to keep the internet a citizen-centric and open and free network is if the netizens, you know, both in democracies and elsewhere, engage and insist. And I'm going to wrap up with a quote from Alaa Abdel Fattah, who was actually one of the early activists in the Kafaya movement and so on, and was very active in Tahrir Square. And he was interviewed by Sami Ben Gharbia last fall. And Sami wrote this long essay about kind of the Western internet freedom policy. And he asked a number of activists who live in authoritarian countries the same question that Ahmed was asked, you know, what can the West do? And Alaa's response was, deal with your own backyards. You know, get it right at home. Because if you don't get it right at home, our governments are just going to use what you're doing and your structures and your approaches as an excuse. And so this is a very important thing. And so I've run out of time. So just end with this idea that internet freedom starts at home, not only on a political and governmental level, but also in terms of our companies, in terms of the political demands we're making. Let's be aware that in cyberspace, there are the same kinds of trade-offs that we face as in physical space. You want perfect security, you're going to have no freedom. How do we balance this? So thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was very powerful. And also, thank you for keeping us on time, because we're trying to get a self-discipline award for timeliness. But you can see why Rebecca has brought how she's brought such needed intellectual leadership to New America on this subject. We're going to shift gears and watch a video from somebody who is not allowed to travel and couldn't be with us. And this is Ioannis Sanchez, who's one of Cuba's foremost bloggers. In Cuba, being a blogger is an activist. I was hesitating between calling her an activist and a blogger. But as many of you know, she writes a blog called Generation Y. And we had copies of the book out for sale earlier. Ioannis is, she's been awarded numerous prizes by defenders of free speech, including an award by from the State Department, Columbia University, El País in Spain. She's been named one of the most 100 influential people in the world by Time magazine. I'm sure many of you are familiar with her story. The thing I was most struck by in looking at her book was that it got blurbed by Barack Obama. And I didn't know he blurbed that many books. As a way of introduction, for those of you who are not familiar with Ioannis' blog, and we'll hear from her in 1 second, I just wanted to read a couple of entries to give you a sense of how she writes, and we're going to meet her translator in a second as well. This is a compilation of a lot of her entries. Here is her reaction to one of the numerous times in which she went to the government office to get a visa to travel to appear at a conference, and not for the first time she was told no. And she writes, while they were telling me no, I recalled the declarations made by Miguel Barnet a couple of months ago. The president of the Cuban Writers and Artists Union affirmed that all Cubans could travel, except those who have a debt to the justice system. I spent the day searching for some legal reason hanging over me, but nothing came to mind. Even the rice cooker I bought on credit at the ration store is paid for in full, though it only worked for 2 months before it completely broke down. And another entry that I thought was apropos of today's conversation. A couple of years ago, I went to the DHL office in Miramar to send some family videos to friends in Spain. The clerk looked at me as if I were asking to send a molecule of oxygen to another galaxy. Without even touching the mini cassette, she told me that the Havana branch only accepted VHS. I thought it was a question of size, but the explanation she gave me was even more surprising. It's just that our machines to view the content only read the large cassettes. When I tried to insist, the woman suspected that I wanted to send enemy propaganda abroad rather than the smiling face of my son. So I thought that was very apropos, and at least the person was very transparent about what the issue was. And this question of DHL enabling or not enabling certain activity reminds us that what we mean by new technologies varies depending on the countries that we're talking about. It wasn't that long ago when we talked about fax machines and the like in Eastern Europe. And she also goes on to make the comparison between the dilemmas that Google faced in China in terms of how it behaves and what DHL is facing in Cuba. I mean, the idea that your DHL office is censoring your cassettes. Anyways, without further ado for now, let's hear from Ioanni, who sent this video, given that she couldn't be here in person.
Aquí, desde La Habana, a todos los participantes del evento que ha organizado la New American Foundation, donde están invitados muchos bloggers que me hubiera encantado conocer de manera personal, de manera física, ¿no? Lamentablemente soy una periodista ciudadana, una blogger que no puede salir de su país, precisamente por haber abierto hace ya 4 años, desde abril del año 2007, un blog en internet llamado Generación Y, pues estoy condenada a la inmovilidad insular. O sea, uno de los castigos por escribir lo que pienso, por narrar de manera crítica esa realidad que los medios oficiales esconden o silencian, pues se ha tomado contra mí la represalia de no dejarme salir de territorio nacional. No obstante a eso, mi palabra, mi voz, mis escritos pueden darle la vuelta al mundo, gracias no solamente al interés que hay sobre esta isla, sino también a la solidaridad, a las manos amigas de decenas de personas que me ayudan a traducir mis textos, a publicarlos en la web, a difundirlos en los espacios como este que ahora comparto con ustedes. Vivo en una isla que yo llamo la isla de los desconectados. Las últimas estadísticas oficiales dicen que de cada 1000 cubanos, solo 159 tienen acceso al ciberespacio, a Internet, ¿no? En realidad es una estadística falseada y engordada, puesto que en ese número están contando también a personas que solamente tienen acceso a una intranet local muy cerrada, con muchas páginas censuradas. De manera que es un verdadero milagro que en esta isla de los desconectados, una pequeña comunidad de bloggers alternativos, hayamos encontrado nuestra voz, hayamos encontrado la manera de hacerle grietas al muro del control, del monopolio estatal sobre la información. Y a partir de esas pequeñas grietas que nos ha permitido la tecnología, pues narrar nuestra cotidianidad, nuestra realidad. Soy una persona que usa la palabra. Estoy en contra de todo tipo de violencia verbal, ya sea institucional o individual. Me considero una verdadera cronista del día a día, una cronista de esa Cuba subterránea, esa Cuba escondida, esa Cuba por momentos olvidada, y sobre todo de una Cuba que nada tiene que ver con los estereotipos turísticos, los estereotipos políticos que se han difundido sobre nuestra realidad en el mundo. Estoy aquí también gracias a la solidaridad de gente como ustedes, puesto que el andamiaje de la represión, de la calumnia, los ataques institucionales, policiales, mediáticos, contra personas que intentan cuestionar el supuesto paraíso socialista en el que vivimos, son muy intensos esos ataques, ¿no? Y bueno, pues mis lectores, y de ahí parte la experiencia principal que he tenido en estos 4 años, mis lectores se han constituido en el escudo protector. Las personas que se acercan a mi sitio, que leen mis palabras, que opinan, cuestionan, se sienten sencillamente identificadas o contrarias a lo que digo, pues sin saberlo quizás hacen alrededor mío un halo protector que me ha permitido llegar hasta aquí, ¿no? La solidaridad de bloggers de otras partes del mundo es muy importante para nosotros. No solamente porque ahora mismo nos sentimos como Robinson Crusoe abandonado en su isla, sin la posibilidad de conectarnos libremente a Internet, sin la posibilidad de usar muchas de esas tecnologías que son ya un emblema del siglo XXI, de la aldea global, sino también porque la solidaridad nos permite seguir. El hecho de que mencionen nuestros nombres, de que se acerquen a la lectura de la blogósfera alternativa cubana, de la gente, por ejemplo, que desde Cuba está utilizando la herramienta de Twitter, es algo muy importante para continuar nuestra labor. Desde agosto del 2007, ese pequeño pájaro azul que es Twitter, con sus pequeños textos de 140 caracteres, ha cambiado también nuestra vida. Nos ha permitido informar, reportar, lanzar mensajes de SOS al mundo, decir en tiempo real lo que nos está ocurriendo. Tengo 1001 experiencias de cómo ha evolucionado el papel del ciudadano, la voz de la ciudadanía, gracias a estas pequeñas tecnologías, al artilugio del teléfono celular, a la posibilidad de enviar y recibir SMS, y bueno, también gracias a Twitter, ¿no? Así que les pido que todo aquel que quiera ayudarnos, que quiera colaborar en este empeño personal y nacional, pues el mejor camino es la información, la noticia, la bibliografía tecnológica que nos falta tanto, y sobre todo la difusión. Toda persona que nos difunde nos permite avanzar un día más, proyectar más alto nuestra voz. Lamento otra vez no estar con ustedes. Me encantaría escuchar las discusiones en las mesas y en los diferentes paneles que tendrá este encuentro. Sé que hubiera podido aprender mucho y bueno, pues quizás por eso el gobierno de mi país no me deja viajar. No obstante, mi blog está ahí, mi voz está ahí, mi cuenta de Twitter está ahí y no se puede cerrar, no se puede boicotear, no se puede censurar del todo a un ciudadano que un buen día se ha levantado y ha dicho: no quiero callar más, no quiero llevar más la máscara, no quiero simular. Eso soy yo, una diminuta y pequeña ciudadana, casi como todos ustedes, empeñada en usar su voz. Muchas gracias.
Now we're going to segue into our conversation, and while we set the chairs, and I think we need to have speakers mic'd, I'll go ahead and introduce the panel. This discussion we've entitled Internet Freedom's Next Frontiers. Frontiers is a question mark. And I have Omid Memarian, and am I pronouncing that correctly? Memarian? Is an Iranian journalist. He's a contributor to the Huffington Post and the Daily Beast. I think he can relate perhaps quite well to Ioanni's story. He started a blog in Iran early last decade and has been in this country for a number of years, and we'll hear more about his story. Suffice it to say that he has received the Human Rights Defender Award for his work. He's been a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. And next on our panel discussion is Mary Jo Porter. Mary Jo is the co-founder, well, first of all, Mary Jo is one of the people who allows Ioanni's voice to be amplified and heard around the world. Mary Jo translates and has organized other translators for Cuban bloggers, but she translated Ioanni's book and continues to translate her blog. She's the co-founder of hemosoido.com and translatingcuba.com as part of this endeavor. Also, I added this because I saw it in the book. This wasn't on my cheat sheet, but Mary Jo's day job is a transportation consultant. And that would have been very apropos if I had gotten away with the title I wanted for this event. Don't make a face, Faith. First, when we were conceiving of this, I thought the title should be "The Road from Tunis to Pyongyang Goes Through Damascus." So that would have
I could put public transit on.
You could have helped us out, but cooler minds prevailed and pithier minds, and so that's not the title for today. And third, we have Marcus Noland joining this discussion. Marcus is the Deputy Director at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. His work covers political economy of U.S. trade policy and Asia. He is the author of Witness to Transformation, Refugee Insights into North Korea, and Arab Economies in a Changing World. So I guess I can take my place here. I'm excited about this conversation, not just because I get to be a part of it, but you know, we've had a lot of discussion this year about the Arab Spring and what it led to in terms of what we're seeing now in Syria, and it's been a very Middle East focused discussion. So this is an opportunity to kind of branch out and look at sort of, as we describe it, the next frontiers of internet freedom, and in some way too, the story of last year. You know, before we had Tunisia and what happened in Egypt, we had a lot of commotion around the Green Revolution and excitement about what social media had, the mobilization that occurred in Iran. So I'm glad that we can also revisit that. Mindful, however, of the caution that we've received to treat each country differently, I can't imagine, this is a very disparate group of countries that we're talking about, North Korea, Cuba, Iran. It brings to mind Dilbert. I wish I had it with me, but years ago, one of my favorite Dilbert cartoons was a shot of the office that Dilbert works in, you know, the cartoon of the office worker. And it said basically in any office there are three groupings. There are the people who are in the loop. There are the people who know there's a loop, but they're not in it. And then Dilbert, of course, is oblivious to the fact that there is a loop. So you all know which country you're here to represent in that spectrum. But Omid, maybe we should begin with Iran in terms of discussing, you know, now with the benefit of hindsight in terms of the contested election, the mobilization that occurred, in our ADD fashion here in the States, where we pay attention to stories like that for 15 minutes, if that, and then move on to the next thing. Why don't you share with us a little bit the perspective of how you see that moment in retrospect, and how do people in Iran view what's happened this year? Elsewhere in the world, and in terms of their own experience.
Well, I think the internet had a very significant role 2 years ago in Iran. And I can say that if it was not for the internet, many more people would have been killed in the streets of Tehran. It's obvious. But it's, as the other speakers talked about, it was not just because of the internet. Iran has a very vibrant civil society, academia, a very alive, is one of the youngest countries in the Middle East. So people are dissatisfied, and they don't like some of the policies of the government. So it was not just for the internet and Facebook and YouTube that it happened, but it really helped the people to mobilize and come to the streets. And more than anything else, the Iranian government has a huge propaganda machine, and this is something that in the United States people do not get it. And in this war, and they are in a propaganda war with the U.S. And in this war, the Iranian government has the upper hand. They are much better than the U.S. when it comes to propaganda. And it was for the internet that the Iranian people were able to challenge the narrative of the government over the events. So they create a message and they try to make it dominant. And we hear that message. It was the internet that told the world that the Iranian people want something else, and we saw a different image of what exactly people were doing inside the country.
In terms of my reference to Dilbert and being in the loop, I was struck in the piece that Omid wrote a nice piece for our Slate package, and you mentioned that internet penetration in Iran is 38%, which of course would be quite different from Cuba and North Korea.
Right.
You also write that a lot of what the U.S. can do, and this was something that was referred to in earlier discussions, in terms of promoting connectivity and internet freedom can backfire. At the same time, you also suggest that we're not doing enough in the article. So I'm wondering, is it a question of, is this sort of the Powell doctrine of internet freedom? If the U.S. is going to do something, it should be all in, as opposed to just dipping its toe in the water and playing with activists who therefore thereby might be stigmatized, as Jacob mentioned earlier.
Well, if you ask me this, I think we, when it comes to Iran in Washington, we do not have a solid policy. I think when it comes about Libya, I think everybody was on the same page, on what to do with Libya or many other countries or Syria. But when it comes to Iran, we don't have a solid policy. In Washington, we have like 200 different views on what to do with Iran. And we have a failed policy of regime change that the U.S. has different administrations have practiced like over the past 3 decades. And they have spent millions of, if not billions of dollars on this policy, and and they, when it comes to the internet and how to help Iranians to challenge the narrative of the government and come to the streets and change the government, we see, for example, the money the U.S. government has allocated to some of these programs is like $2 million. It's so simplistic that with $2 million you want to fight with the Iranian government that has spent like hundreds of millions of dollars in this area, like the money that they spend for censorship and monitoring and interception and all that is it's more than 100. It's a lot. So we have information that it's like the Iranian government is working on a national internet network that cost them $1.5 billion. And then we are having the U.S. administration, the Obama administration is allocating $2 million for Global Freedom Act or whatever program they have. And I think that's a wonderful project, Internet in a Suitcase. But $2 million, it's not serious, really. I don't think it's really serious.
We're going to get to that later today. But I hear you. Marcus, let's look over to North Korea. The country that I would nominate for being the one that's, at least in terms of civil society and the North Korean populace, is unfortunately talk about the island of the disconnected. As
My reaction was, if Cuba's the island of the disconnected, then North Korea is the dark side of the moon. Right? Just different planet.
So when you think about internet freedom in the North Korean context, does that have any resonance? What does it mean? Are we still in the stages of trying to puncture the curtain that is surrounding that country via cassettes coming in and out? Is there anything that we could speak of in terms of internet freedom? And also, I want to hear your thoughts on the fact that while the populace is not quite on the global grid, as you pointed out in an exchange that we had, the government is, literally.
Right. So basically the situation in North Korea is that the government has prioritized political control over any other goal or value, economic development or anything else. So internally, there is essentially no internet freedom. The themes that we've been talking about are there, but the technologies are different. And then externally, they're actually quite aggressive, and I would be happy to elaborate on that. But on the internet itself, it basically doesn't exist. First of all, just from a hardware standpoint, North Korea has very limited telecommunication links to the outside world. So there's not a lot of capacity for moving data. Secondly, what capacity there is tightly controlled. So for example, if you were somebody, if I was sort of my equivalent in North Korea, I was the vice president of Economics Research Institute in North Korea, I might have some permission to access the internet. And the way it would work probably for a guy at that level is that if I had a scientific or research reason for wanting to get some sort of foreign, he wanted to read an article by Marcus Noland, then what he would do is actually apply to download the article. And somebody would screen the request. And then if it was accepted, then you'd be allowed to download the article. There's a very, 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 very small number of people who have access or unimpeded access to the World Wide Web. That's tiny. The themes are there, but the technology is different. North Korea has only really gotten cell phones in the last few years. There are multiple networks, but the one that's important numerically is there is now a network that's it's claimed to have 500,000 subscribers. It's operated as a joint venture between the North Korean government and the Egyptian firm Orascom. It's mainly, well-to-do, emerging middle-class people in the capital city of Pyongyang. They can't use the phones to talk to foreigners. They can't make international calls or receive international calls, but they can talk to each other. Then
Can they text?
Yeah, they can text. So you have at least some technology there for social communication. Then in the border region, there are cell phones, which are illegal, which operate off the Chinese network. And those people can actually call abroad and receive calls from abroad. And that network on the Chinese border, I believe, is becoming an important avenue for information coming into the country. And then beyond that, there are issues. You have people now talking about attempting to use technologies to essentially radio in information that would be receivable on the cell phones. Sending balloons in that would have flash drives, that would have the Encyclopedia Britannica and the Slate Archive and whatever else people to read. But we're at a point with we're at a point with North Korea where basically the tragedy of North Korea is that the government is almost entirely unaccountable to the people, and it has an almost untrammeled capacity for inflicting misery. So what we're at a stage of simply trying to get information. Not propaganda, not even highly political information, just information to people to allow them to start to try to put some pressure to achieve greater degree of accountability on this government.
Are they is the regime in North Korea getting any prompts, tutoring from Beijing as to how to do this, to say it's better to have the sort of authoritarian networking that Rebecca described to get people, partly for the propaganda value of disseminating nationalist messages, but also perhaps to just sort of blow off some steam? Or is there not any of that pressure coming even from China?
They cooperate with the Chinese on issues like this. And one thing I didn't mention is that they have a national intranet or multiple intranets. So there are people who can go to an internet cafe in Pyongyang and get onto this domestic intranet and look at the highly censored local websites. So there is that. They are cooperating with the Chinese in that regard. But in another regard that they're cooperating with the Chinese is, I think, much more disturbing. While the North Korean government is very repressive and very controlling when it comes to its own people, it's very aggressive in terms of its external behavior. The estimates vary a lot, as does most everything with North Korea. But they appear to have an organized, militarized group basically operating through what is kind of the equivalent of the North Korean CIA, whose job it is to attack other people. Recently, they were involved in denial of service attacks against a variety of institutions in South Korea. The ironic one was they appear to have brought down the financial arm of the South Korean Agricultural Cooperative Organization. At the same time, they were asking for food aid. McAfee put out a report last week on this. I put a blog post up on my own blog this morning, has a link to that report. You can read it. The report is a bit circumspect about North Korean government involvement, but the lead author in his subsequent interviews has been quite explicit. And these attacks are not limited to South Korea. Basically, every think tank or organization in the United States that is at all critical of North Korea, or individual researchers who are doing research on North Korea, have been attacked, including my institute, my collaborators, and so on. FBI is treating this as foreign espionage. They operate out of China, and there's some ambiguity about whether it's Chinese or North Korean, but in some cases it appears to be quite clearly North Koreans operating out of China.
Mary Jo, you're helping to connect the island of the disconnected, as Ioanni put it. Tell us a little bit. I was asking you earlier when you first arrived about how many people in Cuba would read Ioanni's blog. Her access seems to be intermittent, but she's able to carry on, as she said in the video. But how much of a domestic audience does she have? And your answer to this was rather interesting.
Well, first, the important thing the first thing is, I don't speak for Ioanni, I don't speak for the bloggers, I'm not a Cuba expert, I'm just sort of in the trenches translating these blogs, so take it for what it's worth. But Ioanni herself does not manage her blog. For all of those of you who blog, you know, you go onto a website and you've got WordPress or bloggers and you load your post. She can't do this from Cuba, and she emails, generally she emails her entries out to friends abroad who post them for her. The translators, it's now translated into about 20 languages, pick them up off of, directly off the website and translated, and they all have the passwords to their language. And often she can't get on the internet, even literally for like a week at a time. Sometimes she makes little JPEG images and attaches them to text messages and sends out her entries that way. And sometimes she literally simply telephones them out, the people who help her call her at home, and she dictates the entries.
And she used to pretend to be a tourist, right? I love the story.
Oh yeah, she, her second language is German. And she's very, you know, Spanish looking. She's not just sort of this obvious Cuban type that, you know, couldn't get away with anything. And she would go into the tourist hotels, which when I was there in 2008, Cubans were not even allowed to enter the hotels. And these were the only sites in the country that had internet access. Unless you were a government official or a doctor or somebody, you couldn't have internet at home. Only foreigners could. And she would go into these internet cafes and speak this sort of hodgepodge of German, and then she would try to put in a few English words rather than Spanish words because her accent would give her away, and somehow negotiate her way, you know, to getting a time on the internet. But the average monthly wage in Cuba is less than $20 a month, and an hour of internet time in one of these cafes is $8 to $12. And it's dial-up speeds, and when I was there, you can imagine coming from, you know, broadband, and you're just kind of like, what? And there were no cell phones. When I saw one person on a cell phone in the entire time that I was there. They were legalized after I left in 2008. Cubans have them, but they can't afford to talk on them, and they can't even really afford to text on them. And they use Twitter mostly when they are able to get online. To send a text costs $1. So you can imagine you're not going to be doing a lot of tweeting at $1, tweeting at $1 a text. But back to your, how many people?
So basically, the blog gets
how many people? Basically
loaded up outside the country, and then
right. Basically, the way the government controls access, obviously, is through just that there isn't any, that it's dial-up, that it's really expensive. But what Cuba has going for it, of course, is the 2 million Cubans that live abroad. A huge portion of which live in the United States, and obviously great numbers in Spain and in other Latin American countries. But Ioanni's blog is read by these people who then email it back to their families and friends in Cuba who get on from time to time. It really is very low internet access. And then also it's brought into the country on CDs. Anytime we know someone reliable that's going, we'll put the entire blog forever and all the other, 30 blogs or so that there are now. We'll put them on flash drives. And flash drives are becoming, very popular. Obviously, they're reusable and they're small, and it gets passed around on flash drives, gets passed around on CDs. Until quite recently, Ioanni was basically unknown in Cuba. And then very recently, the government put together an hour-long television show about how evil she is and how she works for the CIA. So now she is much better known, thanks to that.
Omid, tell us a little bit about your experience in terms of how you got started in Iran, blogging, and how did you get in trouble?
What trouble? Well, I started blogging in 2002, and I was working as a journalist in Tehran. And at a time, first of all, we learn how to censor ourselves. There are laws that we cannot talk about certain topics. And like the Revolutionary Guards, like the Supreme Leader, we cannot criticize the religious figures and all that. And second is our editors, they tell us what not to write and what to write. And third is, the journalists themselves. They know what might put them in trouble. So in 2002, I had many like for example, imagine I write a story and my editor says, we cannot publish this, or they wanted to publish that half of that. So the blogger was introduced to the Iranian society, like I think a year or 2 years before that, and so I was introduced to the blogger, and I established my blog, and I put some of my stories that I could not publish in the newspaper on my blog, or some of the stories that they published, like 50% of the story was published, or 75% of the story. So I put the entire story on the blog and say, no, this is the complete version of the story at this link. So in 2 years, I was, like a year after, I was arrested by the Iranian authorities, and I was welcomed at the Iranian prison, Evin, the notorious Evin. And it was funny at the time, they didn't know. I remember that they asked me, how did you send why did you send your information to all these websites, like anti-regime websites? And I said I didn't send it. They just linked to my website. They just linked. And it was very hard for the guy to understand, my interrogator to understand what was the linking. Linking was there. And I understood, after like half an hour, 1 hour, I was under pressure, and I said, oh, the problem is you don't understand linking. So I said, listen, I understood. I faxed. Every day I faxed my articles because I understood that he couldn't understand link, but he could understand what a fax was. So so I was relieved. And but the thing is, they have thanks to European companies and American companies, mainly European countries and companies, Chinese companies, the Iranian government has advanced. My friends who have been arrested over the past 2 years, they say that the interrogators are much more advanced. They have a lot of information. They are really some of them blog. And so the situation has changed a lot over the past few years, and they are getting they are going after China. They are the second country, I think, after China in developing the infrastructure, on one side, and also on the other side to monitor the system. However, it's very different than North Korea and Cuba. In Iran, for example, we have a lot of prisoners, but these prisoners, for example, write letters from the prison, and a day after, we see those letters from prison on different websites, like many websites. So we have that kind of flexibility too.
Right.
I want to mention that one of the efforts that Johnny was involved in was creating a shared blog among the political prisoners who were blogging from prison. And I can say it now because they've been released and he's out of the country. But it started with a blogger whose wife was the doctor in the town where the prison was, and basically she was. The patients, the guards would bribe her. They would give her husband, their cell phone if she would treat their wife or their kid or something. And so they went through the prison and they took out they removed all technology from the prison, because they were so angry about this blog that was coming out of the country. And the bloggers blogged that afternoon, and that time we posted the recording of the telephone call, so it would be totally clear that this blog had come out that same afternoon, that all technology had been removed.
I have a lot of previous panel comments streaming through my mind in terms of putting this in perspective. We heard early on that in Tunisia, one of the dilemmas that the regime faced was whether or not to pull the plug on Facebook, because everybody was already on there, which again is a reminder that these authoritarian regimes are in very different stages on this spectrum. We also heard Assistant Secretary Posner talk about the cat and mouse game that's played out between civil society and the regimes, and you've pointed out that in Iran the regime has gotten quite sophisticated, as is the case in North Korea. But when we think about, again, coming back to the question of what can we do, and we can mean think tanks, civil society in the West, but collectively it also means Uncle Sam, the US government. How can we engage in this cat and mouse game without it being counterproductive? You've touched a little bit on this, Omid. I want to get your thoughts as well, Marcus. First though, Mary Jo, you deal with these Cuban bloggers. We have this case in the news of Alan Gross, who's a USAID subcontractor, who's now serving a 15-year jail term in Cuba, reportedly for handing out satellite phones to civil society groups. When you talk to bloggers like Ioanni, or when she writes, and what's the discourse like in that community about the desirability of having people in Washington parachute telecom equipment. We're not at the point where people are on Facebook. We don't have a Google technician, as there was in Egypt, to stand up and lead this movement because Cuba is so far behind.
Let me back up just a second, then come back to this, because one of the first comments by the blogger, a blogger on this, Claudia Cadello, a fantastic young woman blogger, was really ridicule. And what had leaked out was a video of a session like this where a government technician was describing to government officials what a link is, what a blog is, what all these things were. And you could just, and this is a very recent video that just leaked out, and you could see how incredibly ignorant they are about all this technology. And he described this internet in a suitcase that is being brought in by the CIA, and it just, you know, sets up, and it's all over Havana, and there's Wi-Fi, you know, everywhere, and people can just, you know, open their computers. And this young blogger was like, boy, we're out there in the streets, you know, with our computers going where, because this internet doesn't exist. It's a small blogging community, but with very diverse opinions. And again, I don't want to speak for them. I think they probably have different opinions about that case. There's been a big legal analysis about it from some of the bloggers who are lawyers, and you know, the sense that Alan Gross has been very unfairly treated individually. But the idea that the main thing that Fidel Castro has used to support his regime over all these 52 years now is his opposition to the USA. That is his reason for being. And the main way that the bloggers are tarred is that they all work for the CIA, that they are mercenaries, that they get big checks, and that they work for the CIA. And I think there's a real question. I think the idea of surreptitiously trying to sneak in this internet in a suitcase to these bloggers as a help is really an invitation for them to go to prison, and certainly obviously for the people that sneak it into them. And recently this television series that it's called the War on Cuba, and it's really about the internet war on Cuba, featured someone who had infiltrated the opposition community and been so effective as being their external spokesman that he was the one who was awarded the internet in a suitcase. So they, you know, have him with it on his porch and, you know, all this stuff, and so they were able to prove essentially that, you know, by this suitcase that he had on his balcony, that, you know, the CIA is in charge of all the Cuban opposition. You shouldn't believe anything they say. They're all government agents for the U.S. Internet access is a huge problem. There is recently a cable has come from Venezuela. It's not quite been, quote, hooked up yet. But I think the blogger's response to the cable is most instructive, which is they're not going to let us on it. It's going to be very restricted. It's going to be, and then it's kind of like, ha, 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 like we will be on it. We will find our way onto that cable just like we find our way onto the internet. One of the, other than going to these internet hotels, one of the main ways to get on the internet in Cuba is you buy the telephone call-in number of someone who is authorized to have internet, and you buy an hour of time and you have their password, and boy, you don't get on 1 second too early and you don't get off 1 second too late, and there's a huge amount of internet access, and there will be for the cable and the broadband.
So you don't feel that there's necessarily widespread demand on the part of Cuban bloggers and NGOs?
I think there's huge
demand. To have Uncle Sam deliver.
I mean, I would ask them to speak for themselves.
Okay. Fair enough.
But it has been proposed by the bloggers that all of the embassies, for example, set up huge Wi-Fi networks on their roofs. Go ahead, do it, so that we can sit outside and.
Good idea. We've got some contacts here in the State Department. Also, I wanted to reference back to Omid's point about the scale of these programs and how we in Washington talk about millions of dollars, and sometimes that's dwarfed in comparison to what the regimes are doing. On this question of the USAID program, as many of you in the audience probably know, there's been a big struggle between Senator John Kerry and USAID about the funding of the program vis-a-vis Cuba, whether it should be $20 million or $15 million, and Senator Kerry has a lot of concerns about whether this is counterproductive along the lines that we've been talking about. And he actually really wanted to be here today to talk about that, but he had a prior commitment with the Dalai Lama. So speaking of powerful, independent voices, Marcus, help us out here in terms of the desirability or not of having the U.S. play a role in trying to connect these societies online. When we look back at, previous history, particularly the fall of the Berlin Wall and even perhaps efforts to infiltrate, Nazi Germany and so forth, I think we kind of romanticize these efforts. But how do you see it today?
Well, listening to the discussion, two thoughts occur to me. First of all, the equivalent of the Google man in Egypt. If the North Korean regime has a vulnerability at this point, it's that Roscom managed cell phone network. And it is interesting to me that it's managed by Roscom. And talk about wanting to be a fly on the wall to hear the conversations between the Egyptian cell phone operators and the North Korean government. The North Koreans have reported virtually nothing about what's happened in the Middle East or in Iran through their official news agencies. And indeed are leaving their people stranded in places like Libya because they don't know what to do with them if they bring them home. In terms of our activities, you mentioned in your introduction that I had recently published a book based on refugee interviews. And there is a chart in that book, which I call the Bill Clinton chart. It's a chart that shows, we asked them the following questions. When you were in North Korea, did you have access to foreign news media? Did you consume foreign news media? And this is mainly radio. And then we plot out by the year they left North Korea to, in effect, get a kind of panel. So the chart of did you have access goes like this. The chart of did you consume starts out much lower. There are people who were smoking but not inhaling. But then by the most recent period, those two lines have come together. The inhibition on consumption has disappeared. And what we find when we analyze the data is that people who consume foreign media are more likely to disbelieve the regime's meta-narrative that all their problems are due to hostile foreign forces. And it's also associated with a whole set of behaviors involving market activity and communicating with peers. So I would say for us, again, our technology in North Korea is we're just a few generations behind, just radio. Right now we have Radio Free Asia. It broadcasts a limited number of hours and on frequencies that it's relatively difficult for them to get. If we could just start broadcasting more hours and on AM frequencies, I think that would mean a lot. One of the most moving things in my career was when I was in South Korea at one point, and I was introduced to someone who really wanted to meet me after a gathering kind of like this, and I'm like, okay. Turns out it was a lady who was now a graduate student in economics in South Korea who used to listen to me on Radio Free Asia. She said, you were great. You were the one we listened to because you actually explained what was going on.
Did you have like a regular gig? Were you like
no,
a DJ?
But they just interviewed me all the time about the economy because I'm the only person, right? I'm a monopolist, right? You want to know about the North Korean economy, you come to me. And so they said, no, you would explain what was going on when we knew the government was lying to us. And she said, we listened to what you said. And I was just blown away. I was doing it as a personal favor to the guy who ran the operation. I had no idea I was actually having any impact in North Korea.
Right.
So I would say we should be focusing on those sorts of much more simple technologies. Radio and forms of information you can broadcast in that may be receivable on a cell phone.
Right. You mentioned.
I think that's a wonderful idea.
In your slate piece, you talked about the Voice of America.
Yeah, I think the United States has the tools. They have the tools like Radio Farda. It has is very popular in Iran, in Dubai, and in the neighbor countries. And I think that could be like they could, but it's underfunded. The VOA could be, Voice of America could be like. If the budget of the Voice of America, however, when you expand governmental projects, it doesn't mean it's going to go to a better direction. But if it was funded very well and it was used in a proper way, I think it would challenge that narrative. And I remember a few months ago, I asked my mom that she lives in Tehran. She's 75 years old, and I said, "Mommy, what do you watch on TV and satellites?" And She said, Mommy, we finished season 4, 24, and what is the other one? Lost. We finished the last, the 7th season or 6th season. And so, but when I asked my mom and dad about the politics, so their version of the version that they give me is the version that the Iranian TV actually provides for them. So, in my opinion, the U.S. government, nobody can beat the U.S. entertainment business. We don't have Britney Spears or like Lindsay Lohan or Hollywood or these kind of things. But the Iranian government is much more successful to create a political narrative about the U.S. presence in Afghanistan and Pakistan, about Guantanamo prison, about Abu Ghraib, about what they have done in Palestine. So their political narrative is much more stronger. It's more compelling, not for Iranians, for the people in the Middle East. So if they want to do something with that, if they want to say what the Iranian government, what they are doing with their nuclear program, what they are doing in Palestine, how they are interfering in Syria or whatever, in Iraq or whatever the U.S. government claims. So they have to be able to challenge that narrative. And as you said, there are tools that you can really reach out to many more people. With internet, in the suitcase, you can reach out to like 200 people, 500 people, 5,000 people, 10,000 people. With radio, you reach out to like millions of people. And those people that are more and so the social base of those governments, which is, I think, very important.
So radio is the answer. That's awfully retro
one
for
of the answers.
Future
One
tense
of the
event.
answers.
No, I know, but in fairness, clearly broadcasting and radio doesn't allow people to communicate with each other, which is kind of a different issue, but clearly it doesn't have the same complications.
And if I could add one more thing, Cuba is very different, of course, because of the connection to Florida, the TV, the person to person. But it's one thing to give the opponents of the regime access to the internet so they can get their words out to the world. But if no other Cubans are getting on the internet in mass numbers, they're still not getting their word out to other Cubans. And if I had $2 million, I'd buy access cards to those internet cafes at the hotels and hand them out to the kids and say, especially when the broadband will be in those hotels, and let the young people come and start really surfing the internet. And you could get a lot of hotel hours of internet for $2 million.
These conversations are inherently frustrating because obviously we've got 3 case studies here that are fascinating, each one in its own right. Each one could take a full day event. So I apologize for just giving you a taste of these 3 case studies, and we do need to move on.
Can I just add one point? I think that some of these ideas, like the internet in the suitcase and anti-proxy programming that some companies are doing, I think these programs are great. But the scale of the budget that the U.S. is putting in this in this program, I think it's very low. And politically speaking, I think when it comes to politics, I think it doesn't show that the U.S. is really determined to change anything in these countries. But I think because of the public pressure, organizations like you and activists and the civil society, they are allocating some money to these projects. But if they wanted to do something, the money should be much bigger for all of these programs.
And I encourage everybody, as I said, at the end of the next session, we're going to have refreshments, and a lot of the participants will be around, and we can continue having these chats. Now we're going to segue to our last session of the day. So thank you to this panel very much.
Thank you. I'm going home. Okay.
Which is sort of a symbolic way of describing a lot of the government efforts to bypass the master switch and empower civil society. This poor suitcase has taken a real beating here today from a lot of participants. So now we actually get to hear, hopefully, a defense of the suitcase. To moderate this next discussion, I am going to introduce Bob Wright, whose biography I am not finding here. But Bob Wright is a Future Tense Fellow here at New America. He is the founder and leader of Blogging Heads TV. He is the author of Non-Zero, The Evolution of God. He also writes a column for the New York Times. I have to confess, Bob doesn't know this, but I get ribbed a lot in the office for having a bit of an intellectual crush on Bob Wright. Because every time we're discussing any kind of session, whether the topic is where the jobs are going to be, the future of the U.S. economy, what's happening in Cuba, how dog behavior, education, you name it, my first suggestion always, we should have Bob Wright moderate that one. So today we are lucky to, in fact, have Bob Wright moderating this great discussion. Bob?
Well, thank you. You have violated the first rule of introducing people, which is always lower expectations. But thank you very much. I have got with me Sasha Meinrath, who is the director of the Open Technology Initiative here at New America, and Ian Schuler, who is at the State Department, Senior Program Manager, Internet Freedom Programs. Now, the context for this discussion was set by a New York Times article on, I think, the front page of the Sunday paper a few weeks ago. I remember it well. It was called, the headline was, U.S. Underwrites Internet Detour Around Censors. Had a very arresting lead paragraph. The Obama administration is leading a global effort to deploy, quote, shadow internet and mobile phone systems that dissidents can use to undermine repressive governments that seek to silence them by censoring or shutting down telecommunications networks. But what really got my attention was the second paragraph, when it described, quote, one operation out of a spy novel in a fifth-floor shop on L Street in Washington, where a group of young entrepreneurs who look as if they could be in a garage band are fitting deceptively innocent-looking hardware into a prototype internet in a suitcase. Now, when I read that, I really did, I think, sounds like a cool place. You know, it really sounds like an exotic, cool place full of cool people. I read further and found that they were talking about the New America Foundation. And I thought, you know, that's funny. I've been a fellow here for like 6 years, and I never see any cool people at the New America Foundation. I mean, whenever I'm there, it's just people like, you know, Sasha Meinrath, and, you know. So I was kind of surprised to read on and find out that he was the ringleader. The description of him, though, does make it clear how he had managed to conceal the fact that he's consorting with cool people. It describes this group, one of them sporting multiple ear piercings and a studded leather wristband, one of them an accomplished hacker, and so on. And it says, then there was Mr. Meinrath, wearing a tie as the dean of the group at age 37. So you're the public face of these subversives, and that's why you're here today. So I want to, this is a very interesting issue, as I think people have gathered by now. A lot of implications for policy, government policy, and even kind of for think tank policy in a way. I mean, it's kind of an unusual thing for a think tank to do. But before we get into that, and before we, I hope, have time to take a couple of questions from the audience, Sasha, you want to just elaborate a little on how this thing works? That helps people get around any government intervention?
Sure. Let me first start by cautioning you about starting memes. And what's interesting is the true history of the internet in a suitcase was that when Jim Glantz, who did a really great job on this article, contacted us and said, so what is it that you're doing? We explained, well, we're doing all this programming, we're developing this software, it can run on a whole bunch of different devices and turn them into blah, 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 and then it just ended up not really capturing anyone's attention. He's like, so what is the thing that comes out of it? And we're like, well, it's sort of a distributed infrastructure, it can run on any device. And he's like, so we have a photographer coming tomorrow, what is he going to photograph? And we're like, that's a good question. And so literally we went out and bought a suitcase and took a bunch of equipment that we had around the office that is sort of the examples of what this technology can run on, and put it into a suitcase.
And the rest is history.
So I view the internet in a suitcase as it's actually a visual aid gone out of control. But the idea behind what we're developing, which is actually the important component here, is that you can use the technologies, the hardware that are on the ground today in these locations. You don't actually need to paradrop in a giant internet in a suitcase. You can transform people's available cell phones, laptops, and computers, wireless routers that you might pick up here in the States at Best Buy or what have you, into your telecommunications infrastructure. And if you use software like the type that we're creating, you don't need a central cell tower. You don't even need an internet uplink to communicate locally. And you can imagine if you can set up a system whereby there is no center, there's no point of surveillance, there's no point of control, there's no point to shut down. There's just a bunch of different equipment that people are turning on, turning off, that's creating this network of connectivity for sharing information, for distributing the phone pictures before your phone actually gets confiscated. That becomes a very powerful tool. Now, if you have an uplink of any sort, a satellite phone, a dial-up modem, etc., this will spread that connectivity throughout that network. But if you don't have an internet uplink, you still maintain local connectivity. And so you can think about this as, what's the first thing anyone that has an office with a bunch of computers do? They network all of those computers together and start sharing files, printers, other services and applications. What we're doing is saying, how do we take that same powerful tool and put it into the hands of anyone that wants to set up a network? So the technologies, actually, the components of it exist today. And what we're really focusing on is, how do we make them user-friendly, and how do we integrate these best of technologies from projects all around the globe into a single package that can be transported not in a gigantic suitcase, but on your cell phone, on a USB drive, on a CD-ROM, on your laptop, or any other storage medium on Earth.
Okay. Now, does every device, I mean, so it's like a diffuse network, can involve cell phones, computers, whatever. Does every device have to have something implanted in it, or some software put in it, or?
Yeah, so you can have hybrid networks where some devices have the software on that. But part of what we're doing is things like, so we have a little device upstairs. It's about the size of a small lunchbox. And it operates as a cell tower. And it runs on a couple of watts of electricity. So now all of a sudden you can throw that into your backpack, walk into an area and have basically a mini zone of connectivity for already existing cell phones to make local calls, even if the cell towers in that area have been shut down. So that requires nothing on these other cell phones that exist.
Okay. But you would have to diffuse some technology pretty broadly across a country to render the whole country impervious to authoritarian constraint. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't think this is a universal workaround. In fact, I would caution strongly, like, this doesn't solve all your problems. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't guarantee anonymity or security for communications. It helps along those lines. But we want to be extremely cautious about saying, like, this thing solves all your problems. It's just a very useful, not just a single tool, but kind of a tool chest of different technologies that can help make your communications secure, can help make your communications anonymous, and can help ensure information dissemination.
Okay. Now you gave him the money for this, is that right?
This, not me personally, but the State Department is funding the project that Sasha's talking about as part of our Internet Freedom programs.
And there's a rationale behind this, I take it.
Yeah, and again, I'm sort of happy to be here and on this panel with Sasha to talk about the program, because I do think there is a lot of confusion about the Internet in a Suitcase project. As Sasha said, if you're talking to somebody and they think there's actually a suitcase, they probably don't know what they're talking about. And so, for us, it was very important. A few of some of the things that these rationale, the things that were important to us when we were considering this, was that it would run on equipment that was already there. It didn't require bringing technology in. That it could run on the cell phones that people were using, the laptops they were using, the routers they were already using, and that it was another criteria that was important for us is that it was basically open source technology. That they were taking things that were already there and developing them, making them work together, in a way that one could easily roll out something that is already a proven technology. And so in the article where it goes into this sort of cloak and dagger aspect of it, and these sort of mysterious pieces of technology, well, everything that it will be developed is an open source project that anyone in the room could freely download. So I think that for us, this wasn't about some sort of secret tool that we could drop in, parachute in somewhere, but really making available tools that would allow activists and individuals in internet-restrained environments to creatively combine them in different ways or find an appropriate mix that helps them get past the challenges that they're facing in the country that they happen to be in. And that's not a matter of us going in and deciding what that is, but putting out the tools that they can use to more effectively do this on their own.
Okay, so I gather one use might have been when Mubarak shut down the internet. Would this have been a really significant tool? You could have overcome that.
This certainly would help address that problem. Again, I don't want to oversell what this thing does.
It would depend on how widely it was spread, how many people were plugged in, and so on. But this type of technology, if it were in place already.
The largest networks today using this technology right now, or different components of this technology, have coverage areas of metro scale and larger. I think the largest is around 3,000 square kilometers. So yeah, it would dwarf most metropolitan city areas. And this is what's currently fully operational right now.
Okay. And so you could imagine setting something like this up in a Tahrir Square, because it wasn't just the internet that was shut down. Mobile phones were shut down at various times as well, and allowing people in a tight area to be able to communicate with each other. And that's sort of an issue where I want to add to some of the themes that came up in the previous panel. I mean, I agree that broadcast technology is a very important part of informing people in information-restrained environments about what else is out there and helping people to ask questions. And I think I agree that the BBG and the VOA and all those efforts need to be supported. But I do think that that's only one piece of the puzzle. And if the past year has taught us anything, it's that what can be truly transformational is the ability of people to connect with each other and share stories with each other and to have their voices heard and get information out. And so when we think about internet freedom, we're not just thinking about getting somebody else's information in, but really empowering people to be able to express themselves, to associate with each other. And these are the sorts of tools that allow that in a very powerful way, whether or not there is a connection to the global internet or however good that connection to the global internet might be.
Okay, so I gather the kind of official State Department rationale, this is not a matter of national security strategy, in a sense. It's a human rights rationale.
Yes.
Okay, but I assume it has not escaped the attention of people in the government who do national security. And I would think one question they would ask is, okay, so your philosophy is just get it out there, right? And let the chips fall where they may. I can imagine groups you wouldn't especially want to have this. I mean, to take a concrete example, in Yemen right now, there are a number of groups who are at odds with an authoritarian government. I don't think I'd be enthusiastic about all of them having this, right?
Yeah, I mean, the really bad guys probably have better things than we're developing anyway in some cases. And
I don't know. Osama bin Laden was using like VHS, right?
Right.
When it turns out.
And have creative ways of, they have found creative ways of solving these sorts of problems. I mean, I think in thinking about it in the same terms as we think of speech, I mean, we allow speech, we allow openness, and we deal with people who decide to abuse those. And so I think that the approach that we're taking is a similar one where, on the one hand, I mean, I think the approach is similar, that we are building tools, and tools can be used by bad guys. That shouldn't discourage us from building tools. We still need to have tools, but we are trying to be smart about how we build these, and building tools that are designed for openness, that are designed for participation, that are designed for large scales of people to be able to communicate with each other. Building in the use cases that are built around people who are engaged in peaceful protests for rights, make it so that those tools are more suited for people who are using them in ways that we envision. Certainly, the intelligence community knows about things that we're doing, and when we talk to them about it, I think they see it, in the conversations that I've had, very few of the questions have been, what happens when this falls in the hands of a bad guy? It's more understanding what the potential, how this can be used by people who are in the country, the activists and the other people that we're working with. I think that it is important for us to keep that in mind and to consider that, and we do, but it's also important for the use of tools by bad people not to keep us from building them. That if that we shouldn't not build hammers that are better, that firefighters can use to break through windows because we're afraid of people using them to steal cars.
Mm-hmm. You have thoughts on the good guy, bad guy thing?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, in a civil society, the fundamental human right to communicate needs to be ascendant and the priority. And like any powerful tool, as Ian mentions, like some people will use that for malfeasant purposes, but the overall massive, useful, beneficial impact so outweighs that tiny fraction of a % use case that I think it's a very clear, it's an obvious win for civil society.
Okay. I guess the other question that nationals, I don't want to spend the whole time on grand strategy. I guess the other question national security people would ask is, in comparing different countries, there seems to be a less than universal approach in terms when we think about which dictators we want to fall. I know in the in this New York Times piece, it said the State Department is financing the creation of stealth wireless networks that would enable activists to communicate outside the reach of governments in countries like Iran, Syria, and Libya. And I noticed they didn't mention Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and you know, for better or worse, I guess our policy is in that sense. I mean, given that we currently are not trying to topple leaders in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, is kind of inconsistent with an undiscerning promulgation of this technology, right? And I guess
well, and the majority of our programs, I mean, our programs really are underpinned by that human rights approach, which we feel is global, and we are doing work in plenty of places that are allies of the United States in order to advance people's access to rights and ability to use these sorts of tools. And the tools that are being developed and put out there for whomever it is that decides that they want to take advantage of this, whether they live in Saudi Arabia or whether they live in Iran. I think that the article certainly does give it more of picks countries, picks particular countries, and gives it more of a regime-change bend that is certainly the intent of the programming itself. We're very careful and clear to make sure that to ground this in the desire to globally expand freedom of expression, freedom of association, and freedom of assembly without picking winners and without choosing how people will use those tools and what they'll say on them.
It's funny, I don't know how many people remember the Clipper chip from the Clinton administration. Just almost the opposite, right? The opposite. The idea was that they wanted to make it legally mandatory to put a chip into every computer that would make it impossible for that computer to be used to circumvent centralized authority, or at least the one centralized authority, the U.S. government. This is a complete kind of 180, right?
It is, and it's not just that, but we then learned from these kinds of solutions. And so one of the reasons to guarantee that all the code is open source is to ensure that there's absolutely no backdoor in this kind of software for any. I mean, it's not just U.S. governments, any government. We just want to ensure that the smartest developers in the open source community have the ability to look at everything and verify that this is completely free of that kind of central command and control mechanism, because that defeats the fundamental purpose of the technology, which is to ensure no matter what, the communications exist.
Let me ask you both a question. Is it your view that even if you weren't doing this, if you just let market forces push the evolution of technology as they have been for the last few decades, that the drift of this evolution is in favor of freedom, in the sense that the internet and various digital technologies have made it harder to suppress free speech, have tended on balance to decentralize power, so that even in places like China, the government has a harder time controlling speech than they did 30 years ago, say, and that kind of whatever happens in the Arab Spring, it seems safe to say that the government will be less able to suppress speech and more responsive, probably on balance, to popular will than 30 years ago. Is that a property of the general drift of things in your view?
No, I mean I do think that if you look back at the history of the internet, when on the 8th day Al Gore and his friends invented the internet, they baked into it certain properties of openness and equality of packets and those sorts of things that made it imbued some of the, with not necessarily intentionally, imbued some of those sorts of rights into it that we began to enjoy. And what we've seen since is the ability of people who aren't necessarily happy with that arrangement to very effectively curtail or bend the rules of the internet to make it work in ways that are more favorable to them. And so I do think, while we do have some of the things that we have on our side of the balance sheet as far as keeping the internet open is certainly that expectation of how it used to be, but also a lot of creativity of individuals who want to tell their stories and want to have their voices heard and want to be able to get access to information. And that is sort of being pitted against this group of people who also have a lot of resources and a lot of control over infrastructure, who have a different view of how it should work. And our programs are really, in that venture capital approach that the Assistant Secretary Posner spoke about earlier, are trying to use the modest resources that we have available on this front to empower those activists, those individuals, the people who are doing open source projects, the people who are using these tools to have their voices heard, try to make it easier for them to push the boundaries, push the future of the internet more towards the free than towards the closed.
Okay, so you think freedom really needs kind of a helping hand. It's not just going to happen naturally necessarily.
Yeah, and constant vigilance. I mean, you look at the last 150 years of telecommunications, from telegraph on forward, and what you have is an explosive growth and use of these new technologies. The home rule telephony movement, which AT&T and the Bell systems systematically undermined from 1913 forward. The growth in the 20s of the amateur radio movement that then got reorchestrated with the development of the Federal Communications Commission and then eliminated from the hands of community members and put into the hands of fewer and fewer folks. The rise of local access television stations and now the demise of many of them. The rise of independent internet service providers and now the elimination of over 3/4 of them in the United States. So I feel like if the last 150 years of telecommunications history is something that we should look back on to figure out what's going to happen with today's ascendant telecommunications technology, without that constant vigilance, we will just repeat that same cycle of openness and innovation and then slow enclosure and control.
Okay, so this is kind of the thesis of the book, The Master Switch. I mean, you buy that argument.
I buy some of Tim's arguments.
Okay. We should plug it anyway because he was a fellow here after all before he went into the government. Okay, so you have a sense that it's really a struggle and you're kind of doing God's work. Hey, no, that's good. I think probably we all do actually in different ways. So you don't worry that there's any such thing as kind of too fast. I mean, when you look at a place like China or even the Arab world, I mean, when you look at the way the politics has been and the way society has been and something like this hits, you're talking about really, really rapid change. And Tom Friedman has argued that in Tunisia and Egypt, we've seen kind of the easy cases. And when you get to a place like Syria, sectarian divisions, various other things complicate transition. And I've heard people I respect argue that for the time being, for the government to prevail in Syria is going to save a lot of lives. These are not crazy people saying you could be talking hundreds of thousands of lives. Do you think there's any chance that this kind of technology would be deployed in a situation like that and things would happen so fast that given the context, horrible things, at least in the short run, would happen because of this.
You're asking, is there any chance that
Is
bad things would happen? Yes.
There is a chance that bad things. Okay. Well, can I quote you on that in the future? Well, is there a significant chance that this bad thing, and would you feel bad? I mean, would you feel, you're doing this. If you're promulgating the technology led to something like that, would you rethink the whole thing?
I mean, I think, like at the end of the day, again, we have to remember that these are tools, and people are, giving people an ability to have their voice heard or giving them an ability to talk to each other more effectively isn't something that we should regret, and neither should we be determining, in this room or elsewhere, that who should have what levels of freedom at what time and how that should be metered out to different folks. But I think that the approach, in a very messy world where things get messy, the approach that we've been taking of trying to facilitate expression, facilitate association, facilitate basic rights will at the end of the day be the best approach that we can take in a messy world.
Okay. And I gather that this is one of a number of technologies that the State Department is subsidizing that, broadly speaking, have the same effect.
Well, again, so the State Department, by the end of the year, I think, as Assistant Secretary Posner mentioned, by the end of this year, will have invested over $70 million over the past now 3 years in internet freedom programs. This is one of a dozen or more projects that we've have invested in over that time. Different projects are geared at different things, and some of them are technologies like this, and dealing with new problems like the shutdown of the master switch. Some of them, when this initiative began to start it out, were more focused on simpler problems like just the firewall, or other security problems like what if someone steals my cell phone. And so we're looking at a range of different threats to internet freedom and sorts of repression, and trying to balance them out with technologies, but also with education, policy work, other ways that a basket of different approaches that we think will lead to more free and open internet and ability of individuals to utilize that in a free way.
Okay. And do you think it's not too cynical to suspect that although the State Department is in favor of across-the-board promulgation, there's someone somewhere in another part of the government that sometimes slips this stuff to some people and chooses not to slip it to other people?
Well, I mean, I think that what we're trying to do with all of this, these tools, is to try to make them as readily available as possible. So the other people, I don't know. I mean, that wasn't the question I thought you were going to ask. I thought you were going to ask a different route with this. Yeah, I mean, the government, the U.S. government is balancing a lot of interests. Again, as Assistant Secretary Posner said today, there are intellectual property interests around an open internet. There are security interests. There are rights interests. And what we do is continue to, within government, bring that rights approach and make sure that that's being considered, and that our policies reflect that.
I think you could run for office. That was very well handled. That was.
I'm the geek. I'm not supposed to be the policy guy.
I was going to recommend a little trim around the ears or something if you run for office, but I think you got the mind for it. That was a very successful evasion. I want to open it up for questions. I want to ask just one more question. When you first came to work here at a think tank, did you imagine doing this kind of thing? When you first came here, you were just kind of advocating for policies, right? Was there a moment when you said, hey, let's cut out the middleman rather than advocate them, let's just suggest that we do them?
So the history of this project is I've actually been working on this since 2000, way before my time here, and had come out to Washington, D.C. to continue that work. The foundation headhunted me to come and work on policy, and now I've managed to merge them together. So in fact, it's actually kind of a return to what I was doing back in the turn of the millennium in terms of developing open source, mesh wireless technologies. Mm-hmm. And the stuff that we're developing, and the reason why we can jump right into this today is because we actually have a 10-year history of doing due diligence and programming and receiving private foundation support, National Science Foundation support into this project. And so what Ian gets to do is in some ways like come in right at the end and be like, okay, I want a cherry on top, let's make this go. And he rests on top of a global development effort that has been ongoing for years. So for me, it's more of like, hey, it's great that, you know, all of this has fit together in this very complicated way to support policy reform and support on-the-ground implementation and sort of to merge these seemingly disparate spaces in my life.
Okay, good. Are there any questions? Am I supposed to choose? There's two in that row right there. That would be efficient.
Hi, I'm curious when you were talking about listening to other branches of government and accommodating them. And I'm thinking about the media companies and the Pro-IP Act and the Net Neutrality Act and the FBI and the Communications Assistance to Law Enforcement Act and Child Pornography and National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And I'm wondering how this approach accommodates that. It seems that you've heard it, considered it, and said, I reject it and I'm doing it anyway. So I'm wondering how there has been an attempt to accommodate those interests.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a number of initiatives at State Department and across the government overall that are trying to bring all of these disparate interests together and come up with coherent policies around them. The Secretary a few weeks ago launched a cybersecurity strategy that ties many of those together. There have been similar strategies within other areas that have been launched via other areas of the administration. Within the past year, the State Department has appointed a coordinator for cyber initiatives, Chris Painter, who's playing that role of trying to bring together these sorts of interests within the State Department and coordinate with other agencies that are doing that. So it is an ongoing discussion, and we do have these talks, and we do make other interests aware of the type of activities that we're doing. And so those conversations, that happens, that certainly happens. I think it is an area that we continue to build, and we continue to find appropriate ways to do that. More and more agencies and departments are getting their head around technology, and as they do, they're being brought into the fold as well. And the mechanisms continue to develop in order to accommodate that.
So you mentioned that you would have your best open source people look and prove that there was no backdoor to this technology. But for those of us who know how to use a telephone but don't actually know how to build one or how it works, how are you going to prove to the people on the ground that this is something that is open and yet secure and that you haven't built a backdoor into it? And how are you going to help distinguish that from maybe a government that is going to go ahead and put together something that mimics your open source software?
Yeah, those are hard problems to solve. So our solutions are make the code widely available. Anyone can go online right now and download the software code and start playing around with it and experimenting and looking at it and what have you. But we also have a series of experts, some pretty widely known in these spaces, and we do hope to work with groups like Electronic Frontier Foundation, let's say, or ACLU, and to say get your techies to look this over and let us know if you find anything. And it's an imperfect, there's no perfect way to say this is definitely open source. There's just a series of checks and balances that you can put into place. But our solution has been, we don't hide that we're receiving support from the United States State Department, and we're also very cognizant that then leads to a lot of concern, which is traditionally, historically, rightfully placed. And so our solution is, well, let's be radically transparent, and let's be radically transparent in the code, and let's make it available. And if anyone does find anything, let's be radically transparent that that's been found and fixed. And so, in many ways, it's like we're just working to build on the trust that we've developed for the past 10 years working on these projects before it was sexy. And with this international coalition of different groups, and to say, look, we want to ensure that we maintain that kind of history of supporting sort of social economic justice as a part of this project, irregardless of who's funding it.
Okay. Joel, you want to finish it off? We've got 1 more minute, I'm told.
Okay, so Al-Qaeda gets a hold of this technology, and there's an uprising in Saudi Arabia, and the regime is overthrown. The Senate hearings are then conducted, and you're in the hot seat in front of 800 television cameras, and the question is, who lost Saudi Arabia? How do you respond?
That's yeah, and then the aliens get a hold of it, and then I'm called in to testify on that as well. I mean, again.
Well, what if the aliens did get a hold of it?
That's right. Then we would bring in Will Smith, and he would take care of it all. That's the backup strategy.
Just very quickly, can you imagine a scenario where this becomes important at the domestic level? You know, Jacob Weisberg said earlier, we all agree that there should be some control, child porn or something, and there should be censored. There are disagreements about what a government should do. Can you imagine a case where you would champion the use of this at the domestic level to circumvent the U.S. government?
Well, you know, it's interesting. So when Ian used the term internet-constrained environment, what immediately came to my mind when I was sitting up here was, oh, like the Indian reservations we work with in South Dakota. So like, I think there's a number of different places where you would want to deploy this, places that are underserved or unserved with any telecommunications infrastructure.
But that's not to circumvent government control, that's to promulgate
Correct. Well,
access.
Yeah, if you look at the history of the development of this project, it came out of something called the Indie Media Movement, where there were massive protests here in the United States, and the government was beating the crap out of people here in the United States. And we were like, wow, we really need a mechanism whereby during these protests we can share information and make sure that even if people get arrested or their cell phones get confiscated or what have you, that information still gets out.
Okay.
So this is when I say, like, this is applicable everywhere on Earth. It's not like just a technology for over there. It's a technology for everywhere on Earth.
Okay, good. Am I supposed to yield the stage at this point, this being the end of the day? I want to thank both of you. I think even people who worry about what you're doing would agree that it's very significant.
Thank you.
I think this one's working. I think you'll all agree with me that Bob lived up to expectations and that Ian's going to have a great political career. And all of you deserve a self-discipline award for sitting through this. Rebecca, I'm going to use that a lot, as you can tell. So please join us. We have drinks, we have some snacks, we have restrooms. Please linger and get to know each other and get to know some of the people who participated today. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you to those of you who watched on the webcast. Thank you very much.